The fire has already been through. Roof beams lie split and blackened across the stone foundations. Storage jars that once held oil grain, wine and perfume are cracked open by heat and fallen masonry. In one palace court, ash settles over plaster floors where scribes once carried tablets and messengers hurried beneath painted walls. In another city the gates are broken, the workshops silent, the harbour strangely empty. A long coast that had known merchants, envoys and warships for generations, smoke rises from places that had seemed permanent. Then, almost as suddenly as the destruction appears in the archaeological record, something larger begins to reveal itself. This is not one city dying. It is not one kingdom losing a war. It is a whole world beginning to come apart. That is what makes the collapse at the end of the Bronze Age so haunting. It does not look like an ordinary fall. There is no single empire whose defeat neatly explains the rest. There is no obvious centre where one decisive catastrophe sends a visible shock outward in one clean line. Instead, what survives in the record suggests a chain reaction across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, sometime around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, especially around 1200 BCE, when several of the great powers and palace societies of the age weaken, burn, fragment, or disappear within a relatively short span. Scholars still debate how sudden the process really feels to the people living through it, because short in ancient history can still mean decades rather than days. But on the scale of civilizations, the unravelling is alarmingly fast. To understand why it feels so dramatic, it helps to see the world before it breaks. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean is not a loose scattering of isolated kingdoms. It is a connected system, surprisingly dense, surprisingly sophisticated, and in many ways surprisingly modern in its dependence on exchange. Great powers face one another across land and sea. New Kingdom Egypt to the south, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mycenaean Palace, kingdoms in mainland Greece, the wealthy trading cities of the Levant, the kingdom of Al-Ashir on Cyprus, and the great Mesopotamian states farther east. Between them move copper-tin timber, ivory glass textiles, grain oil horses, slaves, luxury goods, military technology, diplomatic gifts and royal letters. Ships cross the sea carrying not one world's produce but many worlds stitched together into a single web of need. This is one of the first truly international ages in recorded history. Its rulers know one another by name. They marry across borders, exchange gifts with deliberate theatricality, and write to one another in the language of diplomacy. Palaces track inventories, fields, taxes, and labour obligations with bureaucratic care. Smiths work imported metals that arrive only because long-distance routes remain open. Chariots roll as prestige weapons and symbols of elite warfare. Vast storage systems gather harvests into central hands. Temples and royal courts concentrate wealth that comes not only from local production, but from a world extending far beyond the horizon. In places such as Mycenae, Pylos Hattusa, Ugarit, Thebes, and the great Egyptian centre's political power does not simply sit on top of society. It organizes and channels the movement of nearly everything that matters. From a distance, this Bronze Age world can look stable, even glorious. Its art is refined, its courts ceremonious, its trade routes active, its diplomatic conventions mature. There are monumental buildings, fortified citadels, elaborate tombs, imported luxuries, carved ivories, painted frescoes, and carefully planned administrative archives. The sea is not merely a barrier, it is a corridor. Coastal cities flourish because ships can move cargo more efficiently than caravans overland. Kings can imagine themselves as peers in a club of great rulers, each measuring prestige through gifts, marriages, treaties, and the display of controlled abundance. It is a world that appears to have discovered scale. Not yet global, of course, but large enough that no major power is entirely self-contained. That appearance of strength is real, but it's also deceptive. Complex systems often look most impressive just before they reveal how brittle they are. A palace that can coordinate labour taxation, storage, craft production and diplomacy over wide territory can achieve remarkable things. It can also become dangerously dependent on uninterrupted flows of goods and obedience. A kingdom that relies on imported tin to make bronze grain shipments, to buffer shortages, diplomatic balance, to avoid multi-front wars and central record-keeping to manage extraction, does not need one spectacular blow to fail. It may only need several pressures at once. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, and that is precisely what makes it so compelling. The Bronze Age world seems to have been strong enough to survive one crisis, perhaps even two, but not strong enough to survive many converging at the same time. The metals at the heart of the age offer a quiet clue. Bronze is not a single local resource. It is an alloy, usually copper mixed with tin, and those ingredients often come from far apart. Copper is relatively abundant in some areas, especially Cyprus, whose importance in Mediterranean trade rests heavily on that fact. Tin is far scarcer and more mysterious in the archaeological record, moving along long-distance routes that scholars still debate in detail. A sword-spear chariot fitting or agricultural blade made of bronze therefore contains within it an entire geography of stability. Mines must function. Caravans or ships must move. Ports must receive cargo. Administrators must distribute supply. Smiths must work uninterrupted. Political order must hold long enough for all these invisible steps to remain aligned. Even the weapons that defend the system depend on the system not failing. The same is true of food, though in a different way. The palace economies of several late Bronze Age states are not simple local communities, where each household keeps itself alive independently. In many places, power gathers produce into central stores and redistributes it through ranked institutions. Grain fills storerooms not only as food, but as political control. Labour can be rewarded, provisioned, or coerced through managed rations. Armies can march because somebody counted harvests months earlier. Craftsmen can specialize because somebody else feeds them. Temples can maintain ritual life because surplus exists and can be directed. This creates impressive concentration. It also creates vulnerability. Once the central store fails, or the roads become unsafe, or the harvest weakens, or elites begin to compete, rather than coordinate, the whole structure can lurch. There are hints of that vulnerability even during the age's brilliance. The great powers do not live in peace. They negotiate because they fear one another. Treaties exist because war is a constant possibility. Vassals shift allegiance. Borders remain contested. Some kingdoms are large but stretched thin. Others are rich but exposed along coasts. Some depend on prestige and gift exchange to mask very real pressure below the surface. The famous Battle of Kadesh between Egypt and the Hittites in the 13th century, BCE, often remembered for its scale, and royal propaganda is a reminder that these states are capable of enormous military effort and equally enormous anxiety. They are strong enough to fight for dominance, but also strong enough to exhaust themselves. The ordinary people inside this world must have felt its magnificence and its burden differently from the kings whose names survive. A palace scribe in Pylos counting oil jars, a dock worker in Ugarit unloading copper ingots, a farmer near a Hittite administrative centre, owing labour or produce a chariot elite maintaining horses and equipment, a textile worker attached to a temple economy, a merchant watching winds and prices in a Levantine port. These lives are not grand in the same way as royal inscriptions, but they are the true machinery of the age. The collapse does not descend on marble abstractions. It strikes granaries, harbours, workshops, roads, fields and kitchens. It reaches the people who live at the mercy of systems they do not control. One lesser known and strangely vivid detail of this interconnected world survives in shipwrecks. The Uluburun wreck, discovered off the coast of modern Turkey and dating to the late 14th century BCE, offers a snapshot of the Bronze Age system while it still functions. Its cargo includes copper ingots, tin, glass, ivory, ebony resins, luxury objects and goods from multiple regions. It is in effect a floating inventory of international civilization. Nothing about it speaks of isolation. Everything about it speaks of dependency, sophistication and movement. A ship like that is not merely trading. It is carrying the bloodstream of an age. What makes the later collapse so disturbing is that the arteries once seem full, and then within a span that ancient historians still argue over in detail, many of the major centres that define this order are damaged or destroyed. Mycenaean palaces fall. Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, is abandoned and ruined. Ugarit, one of the great port cities of the Levant, is destroyed. Trade contracts. Some writing systems vanish from practical use. Local populations endure, move, adapt, or reform, but the palace world that had bound so much together no longer holds. In some places there is burning. In others there is abandonment. In still others the continuity is partial, muddy, and difficult to read. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every region suffers in exactly the same way. But the pattern is broad enough to feel unmistakable. Something systemic has happened. That is why this collapse still grips the imagination. It is ancient, but it does not feel comfortably ancient. It feels recognizable in a way that unsettles. Here is a world proud of its sophistication, dependent on trade, organized through large institutions, confident in its diplomatic order and more vulnerable than it knows. Here is a civilization of roots, specialists' archives and concentrated wealth learning. That complexity can magnify danger as easily as it magnifies power. The end does not arrive as a single theatrical blow from nowhere. It seems to gather at the edges first in shortages, tensions, raids, failed harvests, political strain, disrupted shipments, frightened rulers and brittle structures that suddenly stop bending and start breaking. The ash in the ruined palaces is only the most visible trace of that breaking. By the time the fires appear, the deeper story is already underway. A confident age is entering its fracture point. The world before the break has grown rich on connection, and connection will make the collapse travel farther, faster, and more strangely than any of its kings could have imagined. The sea is busy long before dawn. Oars dip in dark water near Levantine harbours, while merchants, sailors, porters and officials move by torchlight among stacked cargo and wet ropes. In Cyprus, furnaces and workshops feed an international appetite for copper. In the Aegean palace, centres monitor incoming goods that arrive not as curiosities from foreign worlds, but as expected parts of a functioning system. Along the coast of Syria, ships tie together regions that speak different languages, honour different gods and answer to different kings, yet still depend on one another with a familiarity that feels almost routine. This is the Eastern Mediterranean in its Bronze Age maturity, and one of its most remarkable achievements is that distance has begun to feel manageable. That accomplishment rests on more than trade alone. It rests on trust, or at least on the practical equivalent of trust among states that are often suspicious of one another. Cargo moves because routes are known, harbours are active, middlemen are reliable enough, and rulers can expect that a message sent abroad may be answered rather than lost in silence. The kingdoms of this age do not exist as sealed compartments. They are bound by reciprocity, tribute, diplomacy, gift, exchange, marriage, alliances, treaties, and coercion. In some cases, the relationship is one of near equality among what the major rulers think of as great powers. In others, it is a hierarchy with smaller kingdoms acting as clients, buffers, or vassals. Either way, the ties are constant. Goods travel with letters. Prestige travels with goods. Obligation travels with both. Egypt stands at the southern edge of this world as one of its most imposing powers, rich in grain, manpower, and monumental authority. Its pharaohs deal not only with nearby territories in the Levant, but with distant courts whose rulers treat one another as members of an exclusive club. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, controls key land routes and commands a realm large enough to rival Egypt diplomatically and militarily. Mycenaean Greece, though divided into multiple palace kingdoms rather than a single empire, participates vigorously in the same networks through maritime exchange and elite culture. Cyprus, identified with ancient Alashiya, matters far beyond its size, because copper is one of the age's indispensable materials. The Levantine ports thrive because they sit at the hinge points of the system, turning ships, caravans, letters, and luxuries into political leverage. Farther east, Mesopotamian powers remain connected through trade and diplomacy, even when they are not central to every Mediterranean exchange. Taken together, these states form not a unified civilization, but something just as important, a densely interdependent zone. One of the clearest windows into that interdependence comes from the diplomatic letters exchanged among rulers in the Late Bronze Age. These texts, preserved in archives such as those at Amarna in Egypt, reveal an astonishingly intimate world of royal correspondence. Kings complain, flatter, negotiate, threaten, gently request gold, send daughters in marriage, ask for specialists, discuss delayed shipments, and measure one another's respect through the quality of gifts. There is formality, but there is also irritation. A ruler may present himself as a brother to another king while quietly keeping score. A shipment of precious metal that seems too small can become a diplomatic insult. What survives in the record suggests not a distant ceremonial order but an active and sometimes petty international society whose members know exactly how much they need one another. That need is especially visible in raw materials. The Bronze Age system is famous for luxury goods, but luxury alone does not hold it together. What matters more is the movement of essentials for elite power and military capability. Copper from Cyprus flows widely. Tin arrives from farther afield through routes that remain partly obscure, perhaps involving Anatolia, Central Asia, or intermediary trade networks that are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Timber travels from forested regions to places where good shipbuilding wood is scarce. Horses, chariots, and specialized craftsmen circulate as high-value assets. Glass ingots, ivory-dyed textiles, perfumed oils, and fine ceramics move alongside more strategic cargo. The result is a world in which the splendor of a palace feast and the readiness of a royal armory both depend on ships making landfall on schedule. This is not simply commercial activity in the abstract. It shapes how power is imagined and exercised. A king who can display imported goods is proving reach. A palace that can redistribute foreign luxuries to local elites is reinforcing loyalty. Temples receiving exotic offerings are woven into the same long-distance currents that arm armies and furnish royal courts. Even styles move through the system. Artistic motifs, technologies, scripts, and administrative habits cross boundaries with more ease than older narratives once allowed. The Eastern Mediterranean is not culturally uniform, but it is unusually porous. Minoan and Mycenaean influences move across the Aegean. Egyptian objects appear far from the Nile. Levantine craftsmanship travels with traders and gifts. It is a world connected not only by material exchange, but by imitation, adaptation, and prestige. And yet, for all its sophistication, this network depends on fragile physical realities. Weather hulls, ports, roads, draft animals, stored food, and local security. Ships are marvels of their age, but they are wooden and vulnerable to storms, piracy, and delay. Caravans move only as fast as animals and roads permit. Messages can take weeks or months. Harvest failures in one region can ripple outward if another region is already strained. A rebellion in a vassal zone can interrupt far more than local politics. The more interconnected the system becomes, the more local disturbances can travel. That is one of the unsettling ironies at the heart of the Bronze Age world. These same ties that create abundance also create channels for disruption. A lesser known but revealing detail lies in the standardization that appears across parts of this network. Weights, measures, administrative habits, and scribal conventions do not become universal, but there is enough shared practice to make exchange smoother than it would otherwise be. Diplomacy often uses Akkadian as a written lingua franca. Merchants and officials develop expectations about transactions, correspondence, and value. This is not modern globalization, of course, and the comparison can be pushed too far, but it is a reminder that ancient complexity often runs deeper than its surviving ruins suggest. The palaces are not improvising from one season to the next. They are operating inside a system with habits, assumptions, and routines. When those routines falter, confusion spreads quickly, because so much depends on them being normal. The sea itself becomes a kind of royal road. Maritime travel allows heavier cargo to move more efficiently than overland routes, and this gives coastal cities enormous importance. Ugarit, Byblos, and other Levantine ports thrive because they are not peripheral. They are central to circulation. Their warehouses, scribes, dockyards, and diplomatic connections make them indispensable intermediaries. Inland powers need the coast whether they fully control it or not. Coastal powers need interior partners for grain, metals, timber, and political backing. Cyprus sits in the middle of many of these movements, like an anchored hinge between regions. Mycenaean ships range widely enough that their pottery appears in surprising places, a small but telling sign of how regular long-distance exchanges become. This network is not purely peaceful. Trade and war live close together. A port can receive diplomats one year and raiders another. Chariots can be diplomatic gifts and battlefield assets at the same time. Vassal territories can become corridors or battlegrounds depending on the wider balance of power. The great kingdoms maintain correspondence because they know stability requires management. They also know that one broken relationship may pull others with it. Scholars still debate how resilient this system really is at its peak, because its prosperity can be read in two ways. One reading sees strength, adaptability, wealth, administrative control, a broad web of exchange that can absorb shocks. The other sees accumulating risk complexity so dense that failure in one region can cascade into many others. Both readings may be true. For ordinary people, these networks are felt not as theory but as dependence. A smith waits for metal. A palace worker depends on rations from central stores replenished by taxed grain. A ship crew trusts that a harbour still has officials to receive cargo and warehouses to store it. Farmers may never see a foreign court, yet their labour helps sustain one. Even soldiers on distant fronts are fed through chains of administration linking villages. Storehouses pack animals and scribes. The glamour of the late Bronze Age rests on thousands of invisible continuities. Remove enough of them, and magnificence becomes exposure. What makes this moment so important is that the system's greatest success is also the condition of its vulnerability. The kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean have learned how to live through one another. They have become rich not because each stands alone, but because none does. That gives them reach, but it also gives them shared weakness. When disruption finally comes in force, it does not meet isolated fortresses. It meets a connected world. And connected worlds can fail in ways that feel eerily synchronized, even when the first cracks begin in different places for different reasons. By the time the age approaches its breaking point, the ties that once made it glitter will help transmit strain. Copper shortages will not remain local. Political instability in a vassal territory will not remain minor. A threatened port will mean more than one frightened city. The kingdoms are bound together by trade, but also by expectation, and expectations can collapse faster than walls. That is the deeper significance of this Bronze Age network. It is not only a story of flourishing exchange, it is the architecture of a coming disaster built during centuries of success, and so effective in life that when the crisis comes, it carries the damage farther than any single invading army ever could. The palace rises above the surrounding settlement not only as a building but as a machine for turning scattered labour into concentrated power. Its walls announce authority, but its real strength is less visible. It sits in storerooms lined with jars in workshops where bronze is hammered and shaped in tablets, impressed by styluses in flocks counted, and fields measured in the ability to summon grain from one district, timber from another, textiles from another still, and make all of it converge beneath one administrative roof. In the late Bronze Age, some of the most formidable states in the Eastern Mediterranean do not rule simply by commanding armies. They rule by storing, recording, redistributing, and remembering. That is why their collapse proves so devastating. When a palace burns, it is not only a royal residence that dies. It is an entire method of organizing the world. At places like Pylos in southwestern Greece, Knossos in earlier centuries on Crete Ugarit, on the Levantine coast, and Hattusa in Anatolia, the palace is not separate from the economy in the way a modern government building is separate from a marketplace. It is threaded through production itself. Oil, grain, wine, wool metals, livestock, chariots, weapons, and crafted goods all pass through systems of oversight that are at least partly centralized. In some regions, this control is tighter than in others, and scholars still debate exactly how much independent trade or local flexibility survives beneath palace management. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because what archaeology preserves best is often what burns or breaks. But what survives in the record suggests that these courts are not passive consumers of wealth. They are active organizers of extraction and distribution on a remarkable scale. The storerooms make that power visible. Archaeological sites across the Bronze Age world preserve long magazines, where large pithoi storage jars taller than a person's waist once held staples and surplus. These are not casual household reserves. They are concentrations of food and value large enough to feed dependents, support specialists, provision officials, and buffer shortages, at least in theory. Grain is political. Oil is political. Wool is political. Once resources are pooled centrally, those who control the pool can reward loyalty-fund military campaigns, sponsor ritual life, and survive lean years better than scattered communities might manage alone. That centralization can make a kingdom appear solid because it transforms the palace into the beating heart of the region. It can also make the system dangerously dependent on the heart not stopping. The scribes are just as important as the storerooms. In Mycenaean Greece, Linear B tablets reveal an administrative culture obsessed with counting allocations of grain listings, of workers, inventories of livestock, distributions of bronze assignments of chariot parts, records of textiles, offerings to deities. These texts are often practical, terse, and unliterary. They do not exist to tell stories to posterity. They exist because palaces need information in order to turn territory into command. That is one of the strange gifts of the Bronze Age collapse. When fire destroys palaces, it sometimes bakes the clay tablets hard enough to preserve them freezing in ash, the last bureaucratic breaths of kingdoms about to fail. A scribe records sheep wheels jars women assigned to textile work, and then not long after the building is gone. There is a dry irony in that. Administration survives because catastrophe accidentally preserves it. The palaces do not leave us moving memoirs of their downfall, they leave lists. Yet those lists tell their own story. A world this organized can coordinate labor with astonishing efficiency. It can support specialized craftsmen whose work depends on regular supply. It can mobilize military resources quickly because officials know what exists and where. It can collect agricultural surplus and transform it into political leverage. It can also become inflexible. The more thoroughly the palace inserts itself between production and survival, the harder it may become for the wider society to absorb a serious shock without the palace functioning. That is especially clear in the relationship between elites and specialists. Bronze Age palace systems do not simply sit atop villages taking a share of produce. They often gather people into dependent roles: textile workers, metal workers, potters, herders, chariot makers, armourers, scribes, priests, administrators, and labour gangs all operate within networks of obligation and rationing. Some are free, some unfree, some locally rooted, some displaced, some attached to temples, some to royal estates. Their exact status varies widely by region, but the pattern remains striking. Specialization thrives because central institutions feed it. A smith can spend time shaping weapons because someone else supplies the grain. A weaver can produce cloth for elite and ritual consumption because wool labour and distribution are already accounted for. The palace is not merely a consumer of finished goods, it is an engine of dependency. This creates a particular kind of grandeur. Palaces become places where foreign luxuries gather, where tribute arrives, where emissaries are received in rooms designed to impress, where craft skill reaches high refinement because patronage is concentrated. Frescoes cover walls. Storied lineages claim divine favour. Ritual and administration blur. In some societies, the ruler stands at the centre of this system not only as a king, but as a sacred figure whose authority seems woven into the order of the world. That is why palace destruction can feel cosmological as well as political. When a great centre falls, it does not only interrupt taxation, it disturbs religion, memory, hierarchy, and the confidence that somebody is in control. The military dimension makes that concentration even more precarious. Chariot warfare, though often romanticized, is expensive. Horses require breeding, training, feeding, and careful handling. Chariots require wood leather fittings, wheels, and repair. Warriors of high status need equipment retainers and logistical support. A palace can sustain such a system precisely because it can gather resources from broad territories. But that also means elite warfare rests on a delicate material base. A few failed harvests, a disrupted timber supply unrest among subject communities, or a breakdown in record-keeping can weaken military effectiveness long before enemy forces appear at the gates. The very form of power the palaces project may depend on stability they cannot guarantee. One lesser-known but revealing detail comes from the end of some Mycenaean centres, where evidence suggests that final administrative activity becomes unusually focused on defence. At Pylos tablets from the palace's last phase refer to coastal watchers and the mobilization of resources in ways that many scholars interpret as signs of emergency. The exact sequence remains debated because the evidence is fragmentary and context always matters, but the impression is difficult to ignore. Bureaucracies designed to manage abundance may in their last moments be trying to manage fear. That image captures something essential about the late Bronze Age palaces. Their greatest strength lies in coordination. Their greatest weakness appears when the need for coordination exceeds their capacity to deliver it. There is also a paradox in the architecture itself. Monumental centres are often built to endure with thick walls, elevated positions, and careful planning. Some are fortified impressively, yet physical strength cannot fully protect administrative fragility. A storeroom full of grain is a symbol of resilience until supply fails and it becomes a target. A palace archive is a symbol of knowledge until the people who interpret it are scattered or killed. Workshops dependent on imported materials cannot improvise forever when trade routes break. Temple estates and royal households may contain wealth, but wealth concentrated in one place can attract violence rather than deter it. The palace embodies order. In a crisis, it also embodies everything that can be looted, burned, or blamed. For those living beyond the elite sphere palace, power must have been both shelter and burden. Central stores may have offered security in good years and extraction in bad ones. Administrative control may have provided coordination while reducing local autonomy. A ruler's court might bring craftsmen prestige and redistributive strength to a region, while also draining it through labour demands and taxes. No single explanation fully accounts for how ordinary people experienced these systems because local realities varied and the poorest rarely speak directly in the record. But what survives suggests that Bronze Age society is often steeply hierarchical and that hierarchy matters when crisis comes. A brittle system does not fail evenly, its burdens travel downward first. That is why palace civilization is so dazzling and so vulnerable at the same time. It stores power physically and symbolically. It turns food into leverage metal, into armies, writing into control ritual, into legitimacy, and long-distance trade into prestige. It can survive ordinary fluctuation because it has reserves. It can even survive regional conflict because it has structures. What it struggles with is a convergence of shocks that arrive faster than central institutions can absorb them. Once the palace ceases to function as the organizer of redistribution, record-keeping and defense, the society built around it does not simply continue at a lower volume. In many places it changes form altogether. The ruin that archaeologists uncover centuries later often makes these places look like victims of sudden violence alone, but the deeper damage begins before the fire. It begins in over-reliance on concentration. A kingdom that gathers everything into a centre gains efficiency and spectacle, but it also teaches its world to depend on a few crucial nodes. The late Bronze Age palace is one of history's great instruments of organised civilization. It is also in retrospect one of its great points of failure. When stored power cracks the systems around it do not gently loosen. They can unravel with astonishing speed, leaving behind blackened walls, baked tablets, and the lingering impression that a world once certain of its own permanence had built its foundations on a stability it never truly possessed. For a while the strain is easy to miss if the eye stays fixed on the glitter. Ships still arrive. Tribute still moves. Kings still exchange gifts heavy with ceremony. Palace storerooms still hold grain oil and wool. Scribes still press signs into clay and record a world that appears orderly because administration itself depends on preserving the appearance of order. The age still knows how to perform confidence. That is often how great systems begin to fail. Not in obvious ruin at first, but under a surface that remains polished enough to deceive the people living inside it. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is prosperous, but prosperity has its own appetite. Large states consume constantly. Armies require provisioning. Chariot elites require horses' fittings, leather and craftsmen. Temples require offerings. Palaces require labour taxes, prestige goods, and regular demonstrations that the hierarchy still deserves obedience. Long-distance trade does not only enrich these kingdoms, it teaches them to need what trade brings. A society can become dependent on complexity in the same way a body becomes dependent on circulation. As long as everything flows, the system seems alive and powerful. Once the flow falters even briefly, weakness appears in places that once looked secure. One pressure comes from simple scale. Empires and palace states can grow faster than the practical resilience of their infrastructure. Roads, ports, storage systems, local administrators, and dependent populations all have limits. A large kingdom may control more territory on paper than it can manage comfortably in bad years. The Hittite Empire, for example, stretches over a vast and politically mixed landscape, powerful enough to rival Egypt and impose its will on neighbours, yet also exposed to internal instability, frontier pressures, and the difficult logistics of holding together a realm built from both direct control and subordinate loyalties. Scholars still debate exactly how manageable this scale remains in its final century, but what survives in the record suggests a state powerful enough to intimidate rivals, and yet not nearly as invulnerable as its monumental remains might imply. Another pressure comes from rivalry among elites themselves. Bronze Age courts are not serene engines of perfect coordination. They are full of factions, ambitious families, regional interests, military leaders, priests and administrators, whose priorities do not always align. The royal centre may project unity, but internal competition can weaken decision-making long before external enemies test the walls. In many ancient states, succession is rarely a quiet matter. Border politics are rarely settled for long. Vassals can become resentful. Provincial governors may be loyal only while the centre appears strong. No single explanation fully accounts for how much elite competition contributed to the wider collapse, because court politics often leave only partial traces. But the pattern is familiar enough across history to deserve attention. When stress rises, divisions at the top stop being manageable irritants and start becoming structural weaknesses. The economy itself can sharpen that weakness. Bronze Age exchange works beautifully when harvests are reliable, routes are open, and central authorities can coordinate redistribution. It becomes more dangerous when shortfalls begin. A poor season in one region might once have been cushioned by imported grain or by central reserves. But if several regions face strain at the same time, or if transport becomes riskier, those buffers shrink. Palaces built on concentration are tempted to squeeze harder when resources tighten. More demands on villages, more pressure on vassals, stricter control over labour and rations. That can preserve elite stability briefly, while making the social base beneath it more brittle. What survives in the record suggests that some late Bronze Age systems may already be extracting heavily before the final wave of destruction, and that makes every later shock more dangerous. There is also the problem of dependency on specialized materials. Bronze remains the defining metal of the age, but the system needed to produce it is inherently vulnerable. Copper may be abundant in key regions, yet tin is less secure, less local, and more exposed to disruption. The entire military and administrative machinery of a palace state cannot instantly improvise if access to such materials becomes uncertain. Even before open collapse, any interruption in supply can send consequences through workshops, armories, and status display. A chariot corps is not maintained by optimism. It is maintained by wood, leather, bronze fodder, trained animals, and skilled labour. Shortages do not have to be total to become destabilizing. They only need to be persistent enough to undermine readiness and confidence. The sea too begins to feel less dependable. The very maritime routes that once seemed like sources of endless opportunity can turn anxious when piracy raiding storms or political instability increase. A merchant who loses cargo is not only facing private misfortune. In a tightly linked world, delayed or destroyed shipments can affect palace inventories, diplomatic gifts, military production, and food security. Coastal settlements may feel this first as rumour. A harbour receives fewer ships than expected. A price changes. An official grows tense. A shipment is late then absent. In isolation, any one of these might seem manageable, but complex societies are often undone by accumulations that do not look fatal individually. One delay meets one shortage, meets one local uprising, meets one failed harvest, and suddenly the margin for error is gone. There is a revealing awkwardness in the diplomatic letters of the age. Beneath the formal language, irritation and fragility sometimes show through. Rulers complain about delayed goods, poor quality gifts, or unreliable support. They ask for resources with an urgency that can sound almost embarrassed beneath the etiquette. These letters do not yet describe total collapse, but they hint at a world where maintaining prestige is already harder than it was. The Bronze Age international order depends partly on performance. Great kings must look great. To admit weakness too openly is dangerous. That means strain may remain concealed until it is advanced. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving correspondence often feels like a polished surface under which something has already begun to crack. A lesser-known and quietly important detail lies in how dependent these kingdoms are on places that are not politically central, but logistically essential. A port town, a copper-producing district, a caravan corridor, a grain-rich plain, a timber source in upland forests, a vassal city controlling a coastal route. None may seem equal in grandeur to an imperial capital, yet each can become decisive in crisis. If one fails, the centre can often adapt. If several fail, the centre's magnificence becomes irrelevant. That is one reason the coming collapse spreads so strangely. It does not always begin where the monuments are tallest. It can begin in the supporting tissues of the system, among the roads, coasts, storehouses, and subordinate communities that make grandeur possible in the first place. Climate and agriculture likely add another layer of unease even before the worst years arrive. The Eastern Mediterranean is never a region where abundance can be taken for granted. Rainfall varies, harvest can disappoint, marginal lands require careful management. Population pressure, if it rises in some areas, can make communities more exposed to poor seasons. Scholars still debate the timing and local severity of environmental stress before the main destruction horizon, but few doubt that these societies are operating with limited tolerance for sustained food disruption. A palace state can survive a bad year more easily than a small village if its reserves are full. It becomes far less stable if reserves are already committed. Political tensions are high, and the wider trade system it relies on is itself under pressure. There is, in other words, no need to imagine one dramatic cause hidden like a missing key. The strain is more human than that. Too much dependence on long lines of supply, too much authority concentrated in institutions that must not fail, too much rivalry managed by prestige and force rather than trust, too many demands placed on landscapes that can turn harsh with little warning, too many assumptions that tomorrow's ships, harvests, and loyalties will resemble yesterday's. Great ages often mistake continuity for permanence. The late Bronze Age appears to have done so on a magnificent scale. This is why the world before the collapse feels so eerie in retrospect. It is not simply rich, it is overconfident. Not necessarily in the minds of every farmer, sailor, or scribe, but in its overall structure. It behaves like a civilization that expects its circuits to keep functioning because they have functioned for generations. It has treaties, archives, storerooms, fortifications, and prestige goods, enough to make that expectation feel reasonable. Yet the first signs of strain are already there in shortages, in anxious correspondence, in overextended states, in vulnerable coasts, in burdens shifted downward in political systems, too centralized to bend easily. The Golden Age is still shining, but its foundations are beginning to move. When later destruction comes, it will be tempting to imagine the ancient world as a victim caught unaware by sudden external violence. That is only part of the truth, if it is true at all in some places. The deeper story is that the world is already under strain while it is still splendid. The palaces stand tall, but their balance is less certain than it looks. The roads and sea lanes are active, but the system they sustain is becoming harder to maintain. The wealth of the age has not removed danger. It has reorganized danger into a more complicated form, and once that form begins to break, the collapse will not create fragility from nothing. It will expose how much of it was already there. The first clear warnings do not come from ruined walls or ash layers. They come from words carried across the same routes that once moved confidence so easily. A king asks for help with more urgency than etiquette usually allows. A governor reports unrest in language stripped of ornament. A port city writes that enemy ships have appeared. Supplies are short. Troops are needed. Grain is wanted. Reinforcements are delayed. What had once been a world of polished diplomatic exchange begins in its surviving letters to sound tense, brittle, and tired. That shift matters because letters preserve a civilization in the act of realizing that its normal methods may no longer be enough. The Late Bronze Age leaves behind many kinds of evidence, but some of the most unsettling are these administrative and diplomatic fragments, written close to the edge of disaster. They do not give a grand narrative. They do not gather events into a complete explanation. They are too immediate for that. One message concerns a shipment, another concerns an enemy movement, another asks for political recognition or urgent support. Yet placed side by side, they begin to reveal the atmosphere of a cracking world. What survives in the record suggests rulers who still try to behave like rulers of a stable international order, even as the ground under that order starts to move. Few sites capture that feeling better than Ugarit. Situated on the coast of what is now Syria, Ugarit is one of the great trading cities of the Late Bronze Age, deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. It is wealthy, literate, and cosmopolitan. Its archives preserve diplomatic, legal, economic, and administrative texts in multiple languages and script evidence of a city thriving, because it stands inside the bloodstream of international exchange. And then in the final phase before its destruction, the tone sharpens. Letters from the end of Ugarit's life suggest confusion, external threat, and a frightening sense that help will not arrive in time. One message refers to enemy ships. Another indicates that the city's forces and chariots are elsewhere. The implication is not simply danger, but exposure. A node in a great system is under attack while the system itself is too strained to protect it. There is something starkly modern in that. A connected world often assumes that support will come from somewhere else, from allies, from institutions, from the larger network whose strength has always seemed greater than any one city's weakness. When that support fails to materialize, the shock is more than military. It is psychological. Ugarit's last letters feel haunted by that moment. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of its destruction and the identity of every group involved because the evidence remains incomplete and the region is caught in broader turmoil. But the city's archives preserve an unmistakable mood urgency inside a system losing its capacity to respond. The Hittite world shows similar signs of strain in its final generations. The empire centered at Hattusir is large, formidable, and deeply enmeshed in both diplomacy and coercion. It deals constantly with internal revolts, frontier problems, vassal management, and the logistics of sustaining imperial authority across difficult terrain. Some surviving texts refer to shortages and requests for grain, a reminder that even powerful inland states can become vulnerable when food systems tighten. In one especially striking pattern, rulers who would once have spoken from secure superiority are found negotiating from need. That does not prove immediate collapse on its own. Strong states can survive scarcity and unrest, but it shows that trouble is not confined to the outer edges. The pressure is reaching the center. Egyptian records, though different in style and purpose, also add to the sense that the age is becoming more dangerous. Egyptian royal inscriptions are never neutral reports. They are performances of kingship designed to magnify victory and preserve authority. Even so, the very fact that later pharaohs describe attacks from foreign groups, turmoil along frontiers and large-scale military responses tells its own story. These records must be read carefully because they shape events into propaganda. But propaganda is useful precisely because it responds to real anxieties. A ruler does not celebrate defeating invaders unless invasion has become a meaningful threat. A state does not boast of preserving order unless order is visibly difficult to keep. The letters and archives also reveal something subtler, the problem of delay. Ancient governments do not move at the speed of modern states. A message may take days or weeks. Decisions are filtered through hierarchy, distance, and uncertainty. Reinforcements can be requested long before they can realistically arrive. A ruler may know that a vassal is under threat, yet be unable to act because another frontier is already unstable. Harvest transport is interrupted or troops are committed elsewhere. This lag turns crisis into multiplication. One threatened city pulls resources from another. One delayed shipment creates scarcity somewhere else. One plea for help exposes another zone already too weak to provide it. The letters of the period feel tense partly because they preserve this widening gap between administrative intention and practical capacity. A lesser known but revealing detail lies in the difference between how archives are meant to function and how they survive. Most letters are written because officials assume continuity. They expect that the message will be received, answered, filed, and eventually replaced by newer messages in the ongoing life of the state. The letters that survive from the collapse do so because continuity fails. Archives are burned, abandoned, buried, or left frozen at the final moment. That means each surviving letter is a small bureaucratic act interrupted by catastrophe. It was never intended as a monument. It becomes one only because the system around it ends. That is why these texts feel so intimate. They are not composed with the dignity of hindsight. They are fragments of ordinary governance caught at the edge of impossibility. The language of these documents is often restrained, which only makes them more unsettling. Ancient administrators do not usually write in dramatic flourishes. They note shortages, request action, mention danger, ask for grain, describe ships, report movement, account for missing resources. Yet under that restraint sits a growing instability that can be felt almost physically. A message that asks for help implies the sender no longer trusts local resilience. A note about ships offshore implies coasts are no longer secure. A complaint about grain means survival itself is entering the political sphere more sharply than before. The age is not merely facing war. It is facing the erosion of ordinary confidence. There is also a strong element of isolation creeping into these records. Even in a connected system, crisis can make each centre suddenly feel alone. A port city under pressure cannot eat diplomatic language. A provincial governor facing unrest cannot defend walls with promises. A king whose authority depends on redistribution cannot easily admit that his stores are strained. Scholars still debate how much coordination remains possible during the final decades of the Bronze Age collapse, and the answer likely varies by region. But the surviving correspondence suggests a world in which communication remains active while collective capacity is weakening. That is a dangerous combination. People still know enough to understand the scale of the problem, but not enough to stop it. The image of a cracking world becomes even stronger when the letters are read alongside archaeology. A plea survives from a city that will soon burn. An archive records administrative normality in a palace about to be abandoned. A request for aid points toward a larger network already too damaged to answer. It is not that the texts solve the collapse for us. They do something more valuable. They place human voices, however formal, inside the narrowing corridor before destruction. They remind us that the collapse is not just an archaeological pattern reconstructed centuries later. It is a lived experience of mounting pressure, delayed response, and growing disbelief. No single archive explains the whole catastrophe. Ugarit does not speak for Greece. Egyptian inscriptions do not neatly explain the fall of Hattusa. Mycenaean tablets reveal administrative stress, but not the motives of every attacker or the timing of every raid. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars are right to be cautious, but taken together, the letters are among the strongest signs that the collapse is not a myth, created by modern historians stitching together unrelated ruins. The people inside the system are already feeling it. They are writing through it. They're trying in the old language of kingship and bureaucracy to hold the world in place with requests, orders, inventories, warnings, and appeals. They cannot. That is the silent conclusion behind these records. The letters continue until they do not. The archives fill until they are buried. The messages ask for grain troops, recognition, action, and rescue. Then the buildings that stored them burn or fall. What remains centuries later is not only evidence of destruction, but evidence of awareness. The rulers and officials of the late Bronze Age are not blind to danger. They see enough to know that the world is becoming harder to manage. Their tragedy is not ignorance. It is that they belong to systems too strained, too slow, and too brittle to reverse what has already begun. Then the violence begins to move differently. For generations, war had been familiar to the kingdoms of the Bronze Age. Borders were contested, vassals rebelled, great powers threatened one another, and armies marched with all the old confidence of states that believed conflict could still be managed through treaties, prestige, and force. But the trouble now does not stay within those older boundaries. It becomes less predictable, less ceremonial, and harder to absorb. Raids strike coastlines that had grown wealthy from trade. Maritime routes that once carried copper, oil, timber, and diplomatic gifts begin carrying fear. On land, too, movement increases displaced groups, armed bands, refugees, opportunists, perhaps mercenaries cut loose from weakened masters, perhaps communities pushed by hunger or political collapse farther away. The old world had known war. What it begins to face now is something more diffuse and more dangerous, because violence is no longer acting on a stable system from outside. It is moving through a system already under strain. That distinction matters. A rich and organized kingdom can often survive one enemy. It can raise troops, fortify cities, demand support from vassals, and absorb losses. But a kingdom already struggling with shortages, delayed communications, internal rivalries, and uncertain loyalties is in a different position entirely. A raid on one port does not remain one port's problem if ships stop sailing. A burned coastal town does not remain local if it had been handling copper grain or administrative traffic essential to inland centres. In a connected world, violence can cascade. A single attack may damage confidence as much as infrastructure. Merchants grow cautious, officials become defensive, Garrisons are stretched. Rumour travels faster than relief. What survives in the record suggests that by the time the worst destruction spreads, the ancient world is already vulnerable to this kind of multiplication. The coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean are especially exposed. Prosperity had made them central. Harbours, warehouses, shipyards and port administrations had turned maritime cities into vital organs of the Bronze Age system. That also made them attractive targets. A raid on a coastal city could yield food metals, captives and transport vessels, while also disrupting the routes that sustained larger political centres. It is easy from a modern distance to imagine raiding as a primitive sideshow beside formal warfare, but in fragile periods raids can become strategically devastating. They unsettle trade, drain military attention, and force centralised states to defend too many points at once. A palace accustomed to projecting power inland may discover that defending an entire coast is another problem altogether. The famous references to attacking groups in Egyptian records later become the most widely remembered image of this violent age, but the reality is almost certainly broader and messier than one dramatic label. The old phrase "sea peoples" has an undeniable power, which is perhaps why it has so often been treated as a complete explanation, rather than one part of a larger crisis. Yet scholars still debate who these groups were, whether they were coherent peoples in any stable ethnic sense, whether some were migrants with families while others were raiders or mercenaries, and how far their movements were causes rather than symptoms of wider collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, and Egyptian inscriptions, for all their value, are royal texts shaped by ideology. Still, even if the famous label oversimplifies the pattern of maritime violence is difficult to dismiss, coastal insecurity becomes real enough to change the behaviour of states. One of the grimmer possibilities is that this violence feeds on prior weakness. A hungry region may produce displaced people. A weakened kingdom may fail to pay or control soldiers. A shattered vassal zone may send armed survivors outward. A port that can no longer rely on secure trade may turn to seizure. Once enough centres are destabilised, the distinction between invasion, migration, piracy, rebellion and survival can begin to blur. This is one reason the late Bronze Age collapse remains so difficult to reduce to a single cause. The people moving through it may not fall into neat categories. Some may have been organised war bands. Some may have been uprooted families. Some may have been local groups taking advantage of failing authority. Some may have shifted between all of these roles as conditions worsened. The ancient sources often record threat more clearly than identity. There is particular terror in the image of ships appearing offshore in a world that depends on ships for life. For generations, sails on the horizon may have meant exchange, communication, profit, news, and expected contact. Now the same horizon becomes ambiguous. The sea no longer guarantees connection. It becomes a line from which danger can arrive quickly, unpredictably, and at multiple points. A harbour city cannot know with certainty whether the next approach brings copper ingots or armed men. That change in expectation is itself a form of collapse. Trade relies not only on routes but on trust. Once trust weakens, the economic and psychological structure of the coast begins to fray even before every major city burns. The inland kingdoms face a related problem. Violence at the edges forces decisions at the centre. Troops are redirected. Chariot forces are moved away from one frontier to protect another. Coastal garrisons must be reinforced, leaving inland routes thinner. Vassals may be told to defend themselves, which reveals very quickly whether they still can. In some cases, messages from the final years suggest precisely this kind of overextension, with forces absent from the places that suddenly need them most. A city under threat appeals upward only to find that the larger state has already committed its strength elsewhere. Great kingdoms often look mighty until they must defend every vulnerable point at once. Then scale becomes a burden rather than an advantage. A lesser-known but telling detail of this violent phase is that some destruction may have come from very near rather than very far. Not every burning city must have fallen to exotic invaders from across the sea. Some may have been struck by neighbouring rivals, rebellious subjects, opportunistic local leaders or populations who had lived for generations beneath palace extraction and saw in the weakening of central power a chance to break free. Archaeology can reveal destruction, abandonment and rebuilding, but it does not always identify the exact hands that lit the fire. That uncertainty matters. It reminds us that collapse often scrambles social order so thoroughly that enemies do not need to arrive from outside a civilization to destroy it. They may already be embedded within its strained and hierarchical structure. The violence also changes the character of military power. Bronze Age states had invested heavily in elite forms of warfare, especially chariotry court-centered armories and high-status combat cultures tied to aristocratic systems. Those are formidable under controlled conditions, but they are not always ideal for dispersed, repeated, unpredictable attacks across rough terrain or fractured coastlines. Larger, slower, more centralized military systems can be worn down by enemies who do not offer a single decisive battle. Scholars still debate how far tactical change contributed to the wider collapse, but there is little doubt that old military prestige could become less useful in a world where danger was everywhere and nowhere in particular. As raids deepen, the damage extends beyond bodies and walls. Violence destroys confidence in timing, in storage, in travel, in hierarchy. Farmers near threatened regions may abandon fields or harvest early. Merchants avoid risky routes. Officials hoard. Communities fortify in haste or flee altogether. Grain shipments fail to arrive, which sharpens hunger, which produces more instability, which can produce more movement and more violence. This is how a raid becomes more than a raid. It enters the bloodstream of an already stressed world and helps turn weakness into unraveling. No single explanation fully accounts for the speed of the process, but cycles like this go some distance toward explaining why the collapse seems to gather force so quickly once it is underway. The old diplomatic language offers little protection against such a landscape. Treaties assume rulers who still control their territories. Gift exchange assumes routes that still function. Prestige assumes audiences who still believe in the permanence of the order being performed. Raiding displacement and military fragmentation erode all three. A palace can store grain for a season, perhaps for more, but it cannot store legitimacy once the roads are dangerous and the coasts uncertain. It cannot make people trust a system that can no longer guarantee security. That may be the deeper significance of this violent turn. The attacks are destructive in themselves, but their greater power lies in showing everyone that the world is no longer governable in the old way. By the time this phase is fully visible, the collapse is no longer merely a matter of strain recorded in letters or shortages managed by bureaucracy. It has become kinetic. It arrives in burning timber, broken harbours, moving populations, and frightened rulers stretching their resources thin. The Bronze Age kingdoms had long understood how to negotiate tax, store, threaten, and fight. What they are now facing is a crisis that slips through all those instruments at once. Raids do not create the collapse alone, but they make it visible in firelight. They strike the connected edges of a fragile world and help turn a period of pressure into something far harder to reverse. After the warnings and the raids come the layers of ash. Archaeology finds them again and again across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, not always in the same year, not always from the same cause, not always with the same finality, but often enough to suggest that the crisis is no longer local. A palace burns in one region, a port is destroyed in another, a citadel is abandoned, rebuilt, and burned again. In some places the destruction is violent and sudden. In others it is followed by uneasy reoccupation, poorer architecture, fewer imports, and a sense that continuity is surviving only in diminished form. What makes this stage so unnerving is not merely that cities fall. Cities had fallen before. It is that the pattern begins to feel cumulative, as though one centre after another is being pulled into the same dark current. At Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other centres of the Mycenaean world, the archaeological record preserves signs of crisis around the end of the Bronze Age. Not every site shares the same fate, and scholars still debate the precise sequence and local causes of destruction in each case. Some places may suffer earthquake damage before human violence. Some may be attacked from outside. Some may experience internal conflict or prolonged decline rather than a single catastrophic end. But the broad pattern remains difficult to ignore. The palace system that had dominated mainland Greece weakens, fractures, and in many places disappears. Administrative writing in Linear B vanishes with it. Monumental centres cease to function in the old way. The world of centralised Mycenaean rule does not smoothly evolve into something else. It breaks. Pylos is one of the clearest and saddest examples. Its palace, with its storerooms, archives, and finely organised bureaucracy, seems active almost until the end. The final tablets suggest administration still functioning, still counting, still preparing, perhaps even reacting to imminent threat. Then the palace burns. The fire hardens the tablets and preserves them for millennia, but the system that created them is gone. That is one of the most haunting features of the collapse. So many final records feel unfinished. They do not describe the end because they belong to people who still expect tomorrow's work to continue. The destruction interrupts not just structures but assumptions. Farther east, Ugarit meets an even more absolute end. Once one of the great commercial and diplomatic hubs of the region, it is destroyed so completely that its final archives become like sealed testimony from a city cut off in its last hours. The houses, warehouses, palaces, and temples of a rich coastal kingdom are left broken and burned. Trade that had tied Ugarit to Cyprus, Egypt, Anatolia, and inland Syria cannot continue because the city itself no longer exists as a functioning node. A single destroyed port might be survivable in a resilient system, but by the time Ugarit falls, the system around it is already failing. Its destruction is not merely tragic for the city, it is disabling for the wider network. Then there is Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, one of the most formidable states of the age. The city is monumental, fortified, and politically central to an empire that had once stood on equal footing with Egypt. Yet in the collapse horizon, it too is abandoned and ruined. The reasons remain debated. Was the city overwhelmed by enemies? Was it evacuated under pressure? Did internal disintegration and supply failure matter more than direct assault? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the end of Hattusa. But the result is stark enough. A capital that had governed treaties, armies, vassals, and regional power ceases to function. One of the great political centres of the Bronze Age falls silent. The Levant shows a similarly unsettling pattern. Some cities burn and vanish, others contract sharply. Some continue in altered form, their late Bronze Age character broken even where occupation does not end completely. In the southern Levant, destruction layers appear at a number of sites, though not in a perfectly uniform wave. That unevenness matters because collapse is rarely tidy. Archaeology does not reveal a row of identical ruins all dating to the same year. It reveals something more historically believable and more disturbing, different centers struck in overlapping crises, some recovering briefly, some not, some transformed beyond recognition. The map of destruction is irregular, but the overall impression is still one of accelerating breakdown. A lesser-known and important detail is that destruction is not always the whole story. At some sites, the old palace or elite centre is replaced by humbler occupation. Imported luxury goods diminish. Writing becomes rarer or disappears. Buildings become smaller, less formal, more practical. Craft production changes. The old international style gives way to something more local and austere. This can make the collapse hard to see at first glance if one expects only dramatic ruin. Sometimes the end of a world looks like fire. Sometimes it looks like simplification. A court disappears and what remains is not immediate emptiness, but a poorer and less connected life lived among its remains. That in some ways is even more revealing than the flames. A city may survive physically while its place in civilization dies. A harbour may remain inhabited while losing the trade that made it important. A hilltop settlement may continue but without the scribes' storerooms, imported copper diplomatic traffic and military structure that once linked it to the wider world. Archaeology often records this as a thinning of complexity. Fewer fine goods, fewer monumental buildings, less long-distance exchange, lower literacy, smaller populations. To the people living through it, that thinning may have felt like the slow draining away of certainty. The speed of all this remains one of the most debated parts of the story. Sudden collapse is a powerful phrase, but ancient systems can take decades to unravel. One city may burn in one generation and another in the next. Some destructions may be separated by years or even longer. Yet the phrase persists, because on the scale of centuries of Bronze Age stability, the breakdown is undeniably fast. What had taken generations to build is undone within a relatively compressed span. Palace administrations vanish, trade shrinks, capitals fall, writing traditions are interrupted, a connected world becomes a scattered one. Whether the people inside it perceive one catastrophe or many linked disasters, the result is the same: the old order does not return. The archaeological record also carries a particular emotional force here because destruction layers are so tangible. Burned beams, toppled stones, arrowheads, smashed pottery, collapsed walls, charred seeds in storage rooms, human remains left in unusual positions, workshops frozen in the middle of use. These traces create a different kind of evidence from royal inscriptions or later myths. They are blunt. They do not explain themselves. They simply show that ordinary life ended violently in place after place. One cannot stand over such remains even imaginatively without feeling the abruptness of interruption. A meal was not finished. A shipment was not unloaded. A tablet was not filed. A gate was not repaired. Life did not conclude. It was cut off, and still scholars are cautious, rightly so. Not every burned layer belongs to the same story. Not every abandoned site proves invasion. Not every ruined palace means total civilizational death in the surrounding countryside. The evidence remains incomplete, and the temptation to force everything into one dramatic narrative is always there. Yet caution does not erase the larger pattern. It strengthens it. Even after peeling away exaggeration, even after separating local histories and regional differences, what remains is astonishing. A whole chain of major centres across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East enters crisis destruction or deep transformation within a relatively short period. The collapse is real, not because every site tells the same story, but because so many different stories converge on the same outcome. One by one, the cities that had anchored the Bronze Age world stop doing so. Some burn, some empty, Some shrink into shadows of themselves. Some are remembered only because their ruins preserve the proof that they had once mattered immensely. The succession of losses changes the atmosphere of the entire age. It is no longer a matter of tension warnings or isolated raids. The physical centers of order are being removed. Every destroyed city makes the next city more vulnerable. Every broken node weakens the roots around it. Every burned archive narrows the world further. The collapse is no longer approaching. It is happening in stone ash and silent city after city until the ancient world that once seemed durable begins to look mortally wounded. Once the cities begin to burn, it becomes tempting to imagine swords and ships as the whole explanation. Fire is vivid. Ruins are persuasive. Human beings naturally look for enemies with faces for raiders on the horizon, for armies at the gates. But collapse on this scale is rarely fed by violence alone. Beneath the ash lies another possibility, quieter, and in some ways more frightening: fields, failing harvests, shrinking storage jars emptying faster than they can be filled, and whole populations discovering that the old agricultural balance no longer holds. A civilization built on surplus does not need total famine to enter danger. It only needs repeated stress severe enough to tighten every other weakness already present. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East have always lived with environmental uncertainty. Rainfall is seasonal and uneven. Some regions depend heavily on a narrow band of winter precipitation. Others rely on careful management of soils, local water systems, and the timing of planting in landscapes that can shift quickly from generous to unforgiving. In good years, large palace systems can gather enough grain to feed specialists' armies, temple personnel dependents, and urban populations. In bad years, that same concentration of dependence becomes dangerous. A village may endure hardship through improvisation migration or reduced consumption. A palace economy has to feed hierarchy itself. It has to keep the machinery of government functioning while scarcity spreads downward and outward. By the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, a growing body of scientific evidence suggests that parts of the Eastern Mediterranean are experiencing serious climatic stress. Pollen records, sediment cores, isotope data, and other paleoclimate proxies do not all tell exactly the same local story, and scholars still debate the timing, severity, and regional variability of the downturn. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does, when climate must be reconstructed from fragmentary environmental traces rather than from human measurements. Even so, many researchers now see a period of drying and instability affecting significant parts of the region around the very centuries when the Bronze Age world begins to fracture. That does not mean drought alone destroys the age. It means hunger may have entered the crisis as an accelerant powerful enough to deepen almost everything else. The word drought can sound abstract until it is translated into ordinary life. It means winter rains arriving weakly or not enough. It means barley heads smaller than expected, wheat patches thin and disappointing pasture, turning poor flocks losing condition, and wells becoming more uncertain. It means animals sold early because fodder is short. It means seed grain eaten because there is no other choice, making the following year still more precarious. It means families stretching rations, local officials counting stores more anxiously, and central authorities demanding deliveries from communities that are already calculating what they cannot spare. Hunger is not only biological, it is administrative, political, and social. It rearranges the relationship between rulers and subjects very quickly. Some of the written evidence from the broader Late Bronze Age world seems to point in exactly that direction. Texts from the Hittite sphere mention grain shortages and requests for food reminders that even major powers could become dependent on emergency provisioning. This is a striking detail because it reverses the expected hierarchy. A state accustomed to commanding labour and tribute now has to ask more urgently for basic sustenance. If grain is being moved under pressure, then transport becomes critical, political order becomes critical, and local harvest conditions become critical all at once. A kingdom can survive military embarrassment more easily than it can survive sustained food insecurity. Armies can be recalled, prestige can be repaired. Empty granaries are less negotiable. In a connected world, food shortage also travels indirectly. One region's poor harvest may increase its demand on another. Grain exports that once feel manageable become politically dangerous. A shipment delayed by unrest, raiding, or damaged infrastructure is no longer inconvenient. It becomes existential. Coastal ports that matter for trade now matter for survival more sharply than before. Inland kingdoms become vulnerable to maritime disruption in a way that may have seemed secondary in more stable decades. Hunger makes interdependence harsher. It exposes how much a civilization had come to rely on steady circulation, rather than local resilience alone. There is also the problem of social trust under scarcity. In prosperous years, taxation and redistribution can be tolerated, even resented, without breaking the system. In bad years, those same structures can start to look predatory. A palace demanding grain from districts facing weak harvests may preserve elite stability briefly while eroding popular obedience. Vassal states asked to deliver food to imperial centres may become restless or desperate. Local communities may hide stores, resist levies, flee obligations, or turn toward rebellion when the margin of survival narrows. No single explanation fully accounts for how different populations responded, because local conditions varied enormously. But what survives in the record suggests that scarcity has a way of turning administrative pressure into political risk very quickly. A lesser-known but important detail is that famine often leaves subtle archaeological traces compared with warfare. Starvation does not always produce the neat drama of a destruction layer. It may appear instead in settlement contraction, in reduced animal size from stress, in changes in crop, remains in interrupted trade, in poorer material culture, or in unusual patterns of movement. This makes environmental pressure easy to underestimate if one looks only for burned palaces and weapons. Yet in many historical collapses, hunger does much of its work by making societies easier to break. Malnourished populations are less resilient. States facing poor harvests have less flexibility. Soldiers and sailors need feeding no matter how grand the court rhetoric may be. Drought does not always topple walls directly. It weakens the people meant to defend them. The wider landscape may also have been changing in ways that hurt agricultural predictability, even where outright drought was not constant. Shifts in rainfall timing, repeated poor seasons, soil fatigue in heavily exploited zones, overgrazing in some local environments, and pressure on marginal lands could all compound the problem. Scholars still debate how much of this can be demonstrated securely, region by region, and caution is necessary. But the broader principle is hard to escape. A highly connected Bronze Age system built on concentrated surplus has limited tolerance for repeated environmental stress. It does not need a biblical catastrophe. It only needs enough bad years close enough together in enough important places to erode the buffers that once made centralized power look strong. That erosion would have felt different depending on where one stood. In a palace, it might appear first as uncomfortable accounting, rising prices tense, distributions, anxious messages, and increasingly political decisions about who gets fed. In a village, it might mean reduced seed, exhausted fields, tax pressure, and children eating less well. In a port city, it might mean ships arriving with less grain than expected, or not arriving at all. In a frontier zone, it might mean more movement of people looking for arable land work or relief. The collapse seen through food is not one event. It is a spreading change in the pressure of daily life. This is where famine and violence meet. Hungry populations move. Moving populations create tension. States facing scarcity may fight harder for access to food-producing regions or supply routes. Raiding becomes more attractive where trade no longer delivers reliably. Mercenaries without pay become more dangerous where grain is short. A single bad harvest does not create the Bronze Age collapse, but repeated agricultural stress can make every political and military problem more combustible. That is why the environmental evidence matters so much. It offers not a neat replacement for older invasion stories, but a deeper framework in which those stories become more plausible and more complicated at the same time. The old palace systems had been designed to master uncertainty through storage and redistribution. For long stretches that strategy works, but storage only protects a society if the stores are there, if transport remains secure, and if the authorities managing them still command enough legitimacy to direct scarce resources without provoking breakdown. Under sustained environmental pressure, each of those conditions weakens. The jars empty, the roads grow dangerous, the subjects become less compliant. The state becomes harsher or more helpless, sometimes both. What had once looked like organized abundance starts to look like concentrated fragility. By the time major centers are burning, some of their deeper defeats may have happened months or years earlier in fields far from the palaces. A poor rainy season, a failed shipment, a district unable to meet obligations, a herd reduced beyond recovery, a family leaving land that no longer sustains them. These are not spectacular events, which is precisely why they are so dangerous. They do not announce themselves as civilizational turning points. They accumulate quietly until the whole system begins to feel brittle. Then when raids come, when cities burn, when rulers plead for help, the world is already thinner than it looks. Hunger has been at work in the background, hollowing out resilience long before the final blows land. Few phrases in ancient history have taken on as much dramatic force as the Sea Peoples. The words seem to promise a complete explanation all by themselves. They conjure an image of strange fleets appearing out of nowhere, swarming across the eastern Mediterranean, toppling cities, destroying kingdoms and bringing an entire age to an end through sheer violence. It is a powerful picture, which is precisely why it has endured for so long. It is also almost certainly too simple. The Sea Peoples are part of the Bronze Age collapse story, perhaps an important part in some regions, but they are not a neat answer waiting at the bottom of the mystery. They are a problem in themselves because even the identity of these attackers, migrants, or confederations remains uncertain. Most of what is commonly known about them comes from Egyptian inscriptions, especially those associated with the reigns of Merneptah and Rameses III. These texts refer to groups with names such as the Sherdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, Jekka-Denyen, and others, and they depict major military confrontations by land and sea. In the famous reliefs of Rameses III at Medinet Habu, the enemies are shown with distinctive dress ox carts, families, and ships, suggesting that at least some of these movements involve not just raiding war bands, but whole communities on the move. That detail matters. It hints at displacement migration, or social collapse, elsewhere, not merely piracy in the narrow sense. Yet Egyptian royal texts are carefully staged narratives of victory. They are designed to magnify the king's power and cast the threat in forms useful to the ideology of kingship. What survives in the record suggests real danger, but it does not grant us a simple ethnographic map. This is where the Sea Peoples become more difficult and more interesting. Scholars still debate whether these named groups represent coherent ethnic populations, shifting coalitions labels used by Egyptians for diverse outsiders, or some mixture of all three. Some names may refer to origins in the Aegean or Anatolia. Others may reflect groups from the central Mediterranean, the Levant, or places still uncertain. Some may have served as mercenaries before becoming enemies. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for how these groups were formed, or how stable their identities were over time. Ancient states often labelled outsiders in ways that reflected their own administrative needs rather than the full complexity of the people being described. That possibility should make us cautious whenever the term is used as if it names one unified invasion force. The Egyptian evidence is still valuable precisely because it preserves the scale of fear. Inscriptions do not usually invent whole categories of military threat from nothing. The reliefs and texts indicate that Egypt faced serious attacks in a period when the wider eastern Mediterranean was already under severe strain. Merneptah claims victory over a coalition involving Libyan forces and northern groups. Rameses III later presents himself as saving Egypt from a much broader wave of invaders who had already devastated other lands. Whether every detail of these narratives is literal or propagandistic, the larger point is hard to escape. Egypt sees itself confronting a dangerous upheaval, involving peoples moving by sea and land through a collapsing region. What remains uncertain is whether the sea peoples cause the collapse ride the collapse or emerge from it. The older, simpler model imagines them as the primary agents of destruction, an overwhelming external wave crashing into otherwise functional states. That interpretation has obvious dramatic appeal, but it now feels too narrow for most scholars. By the time these groups appear clearly in Egyptian records, many parts of the Bronze Age world are already under pressure from internal weakness. Climatic stress disrupted trade food shortages and earlier violence. It may be more accurate to see the Sea Peoples not as a single starting point, but as one expression of a wider breakdown. In that reading, the moving groups described by Egypt are both symptom and accelerator populations uprooted or reorganized by crisis, who then help deepen the crisis elsewhere. That possibility is supported by the images of families and wagons, which suggest that at least some movements are not ordinary military campaigns. Entire communities do not usually uproot themselves unless something significant has already gone wrong. A failed region behind them may be as important as the battlefield ahead. If coastal cities have fallen harvests, failed political hierarchies collapsed, and trade routes become unreliable, migration and armed movement begin to blur together. A displaced population may fight because it must survive. A mercenary contingent may become a raiding force when pay stops. A local group may join a wider coalition not because of some ancient ethnic unity, but because the old order has ceased to feed and protect it. The Sea Peoples, in other words, may be the visible face of social fragmentation spreading across the Mediterranean. There is also a temptation to treat all named groups in the Egyptian inscriptions as equally important and equally understood, when in reality some are little more than names attached to uncertain clues. Scholars have proposed links between certain groups and later peoples, especially in the case of the Peliset, and possible connections to Philistine settlement in the southern Levant. Some of these associations are plausible and supported by archaeology, to a degree especially where changes in material culture appear in relevant regions. But even here, caution is necessary. Material change does not always prove mass migration, and names preserved by Egyptian scribes do not always align neatly with later identities. The evidence remains incomplete, and the urge to solve every mystery through direct ethnic continuity often outruns what the record can securely support. A lesser-known but telling detail is that some of the so-called Sea Peoples may not have been strangers to the Eastern Mediterranean system at all. Certain groups appear in earlier contexts as mercenaries or participants in the military and commercial life of Bronze Age states. The Sherden, for example, are sometimes linked to service in Egyptian forces before later appearing among enemy coalitions. If that reading is correct, it complicates the popular image even further. The collapse may involve not just outsiders breaching a civilization, but people long entangled with that civilization, changing sides, losing patrons, moving under pressure, or exploiting state weakness when the old balance no longer holds. This is a far more historically realistic picture than a clean line between civilization and barbarian invader. The archaeological record supports that complexity. In some places, destruction layers coincide roughly with the period of these movements. In others, the timing is less precise or the causes less clear. Some coastal sites are devastated, others survive in altered form. In parts of the southern Levant, material culture changes in ways that suggest new populations, new habits, or new mixtures of population and practice. But archaeology does not deliver a single neat invasion map. Instead, it reveals regional disruption, movement, settlement change, and overlapping crises. That fits better with a world in systemic breakdown than with a single overwhelming conquest. What makes the Sea Peoples so memorable, then, is not that they solve the collapse, but that they embody it. They stand at the intersection of migration war state failure and environmental stress. They are visible where other forces are often silent. Drought leaves no army in relief sculpture. Famine rarely names itself in monumental inscription. Administrative brittleness does not wear a helmet. But armed groups arriving by ship, families on the move, and coalitions pressing against weakened states create images dramatic enough for kings to carve into stone. That is why the Sea Peoples dominate popular memory. They are the most theatrical face of a much broader disaster. Still, the Egyptian story also includes an important limit. Egypt survives, bloodied, strained, and altered, but not destroyed. That survival suggests two things at once. First, the threat is real enough to demand enormous effort. Second, even a very dangerous wave of attacks is not by itself sufficient to explain the disappearance of so many other Bronze Age centres. If the Sea Peoples alone were the master cause, one might expect a simpler pattern of conquest. What we see instead is a mosaic Egypt holds though weakened. The Hittite Empire vanishes, Ugarit is destroyed, Mycenaean palaces collapse, Levantine cities vary in their fates, inland and coastal systems alike suffer disruption. The pattern makes more sense if maritime attacks are understood as one force among several acting in a world already brittle. So the Sea Peoples remain a problem rather than an answer. They are real enough to matter, elusive enough to resist certainty, and dramatic enough to distort the whole discussion if treated carelessly. Scholars still debate their origins, their composition, and their exact role, because the evidence does not permit a final verdict. Yet perhaps that uncertainty is itself appropriate. The collapse they move through is not a tidy event, and the peoples associated with it are unlikely to be tidy categories. They belong to a moment when kingdoms fail, roots break, harvests suffer, populations move, and violence changes shape. They are not an interruption to the Bronze Age collapse story. They are one of its clearest expressions, a world so destabilized that entire armed communities can appear at the edges of empire and force great states to carve their fear into stone. By this point, the temptation is to keep looking outward toward raiders, migrants, hostile coalitions, and the visible violence of a world breaking apart at its edges. But collapse on this scale also demands a harder look inward. Some systems do not fail because they are too weak to begin with. They fail because they are too tightly organized around a way of functioning that leaves little room for surprise. The Late Bronze Age palace states are extraordinarily capable under normal conditions. They can gather surplus command, labour-manage archives, provision armies, oversee specialists and project prestige across long distances. Yet those very strengths may have made them brittle. A world built on coordination can become dangerously vulnerable when coordination itself begins to slip. That brittleness is easiest to see in over-centralization. When grain labour, weapons, diplomatic exchange and specialised production all depend heavily on palatial institutions, the health of the whole system begins to rest on a limited number of critical nodes. A harvest is no longer just a harvest. It is an accounting event. A shipment is no longer just a cargo movement. It is part of a chain sustaining workshops, rations, military stores, and political legitimacy. A regional governor is no longer just a local notable. He is a hinge in the transmission of commands and obligations. This can work brilliantly for generations. It can also mean that once enough links weaken, at once failure travels through the structure much faster than a less centralized society might allow. There is a paradox here. The palaces of the Bronze Age look durable because they are monumental. Thick walls, formal courts, storerooms, archives, guarded gates, elevated citadels and elaborate administrative routines all create the impression of permanence. Yet monumentality can disguise dependence. A palace is not resilient because it is large. It is resilient only if the system feeding it remains intact. Once trade is disrupted, harvests falter, and provincial obedience weakens. Grandeur becomes expensive to maintain. A central court cannot simply shrink gracefully without changing its whole relationship to power. It must continue to perform command even when its practical capacity is narrowing. That gap between performance and reality is one of the great dangers of complex political systems. The social hierarchy of the Bronze Age world sharpens the problem. Palace societies are steeply unequal. Elites consume prestige goods imported over long distances, maintain military retinues, sponsor ritual display, and draw value upward from large populations whose names rarely survive. Many workers are dependent on central institutions for rations or livelihoods. Others are subject to heavy obligations in produce or labour. In prosperous decades, this arrangement may appear functional, even stable. In hard years, it can become explosive. The more a ruling class tries to preserve its own position by extracting harder from already strained communities, the more it undermines the base on which its own power rests. No single explanation fully accounts for how much social resentment contributed to the collapse, because ordinary people rarely leave direct testimony. But what survives in the record suggests that these systems are not socially relaxed. They are managed, ranked, and demanding under stress that matters. Internal political competition likely matters too. Royal courts are not unified machines. They are human environments filled with rivalries, ambitions, resentments, and succession problems. A king's authority may depend on fragile coalitions among military elites, administrators, priesthoods, and provincial interests. A smooth succession can preserve continuity. A disputed one can expose every hidden fracture in the state. In normal times, strong institutions may absorb that instability. In a crisis, they may amplify it. A province uncertain about succession may hesitate to deliver support. A court faction may prioritize influence over emergency coordination. A ruler trying to assert authority may tighten extraction at exactly the wrong moment. Scholars still debate the relative weight of palace intrigue and elite conflict in the final breakdown, but it would be strange if such tensions did not matter at all. Almost every highly centralized state in history carries them within itself. There is also the question of administrative mentality. Bureaucracies are excellent at preserving routines. They are less good at abandoning routines before it is too late. The same scribal culture that makes palace states so effective in good times may have made them slow to adapt when conditions changed rapidly. Records continue. Rations are counted. Obligations are assigned. Shipments are requested. But if the world beyond the tablet has already changed, administrative continuity can become a form of denial. A bureaucracy does not easily admit that the assumptions built into its categories no longer hold. It may keep demanding grain from districts that can no longer spare it, keep expecting compliance from vassals already drifting loose, keep distributing resources according to prestige rather than survival. This is not incompetence in the ordinary sense, it is structural inertia, and large systems are often full of it. A lesser-known but revealing detail lies in the disappearance of writing from some regions after the palace collapse, especially in Mycenaean Greece. Linear B is not a literature for broad public use, it is a tool of palace administration. When the palaces fall, the script disappears with them. That tells us something profound. Writing there had been embedded so tightly in centralized control that once the institution vanished, literacy in that form no longer had a social base. It did not diffuse outward into a resilient civilian practice. It died with the bureaucracy that sustained it. The same pattern in different forms may apply to other skills and systems of coordination across the Bronze Age world. When complexity is too concentrated, it can vanish abruptly rather than adapt. The military structure of these states may have shared the same weakness. Bronze Age elites often invest in expensive forms of warfare tied to courtly prestige, especially chariotry and aristocratic combat culture. Those systems are impressive, but they depend on supply training, animal management, craftsmen, and political order. If the institutions behind them weaken, the military system may become less flexible just when flexibility is most needed. A state built to project formal power in set-piece conflicts may be poorly adapted to a world of raiding, fragmented loyalties, and multiple simultaneous threats. Internal collapse can therefore make external threats more effective, not because attackers become stronger in absolute terms, but because the state becomes clumsier. Another internal weakness may lie in the very success of long-distance integration. The more palace economies rely on imported materials, diplomatic equilibrium, and centralized redistribution, the less practice they may have in local improvisation. Villages and smaller communities can sometimes endure crisis through mobility, mixed subsistence, or reduced complexity. Palaces cannot easily do that. Their existence depends on remaining central. A great court cannot suddenly become a modest local authority without ceasing to be what it is. This makes palace states strangely inflexible. Their sophistication gives them reach, but it also narrows the range of responses available once their operating environment changes. What makes this inward view so persuasive is that it explains why the collapse is uneven but still systemic. Not every region is conquered in the same way. Not every city burns for the same reason. Not every kingdom experiences the same climatic pressure or military threat. And yet many of them share a common vulnerability. They are highly organized around concentrated institutions that are efficient in stability and fragile in compound crisis. That shared structure helps explain why so many different local stories can still converge on a similar outcome. The collapse is not only a map of destruction, it is a map of systems failing from within under pressures they can no longer buffer. This does not mean external violence is irrelevant. It means external violence lands harder because the internal architecture is already brittle. A port is harder to defend when the palace cannot provision properly. A province is harder to hold when loyalties are thin. A raid is harder to absorb when the bureaucracy is still counting a world that no longer exists. The the Bronze Age world may have been in this sense one of history's earliest demonstrations that complexity itself can become a hazard. The more tightly everything is tied together through centralized power, the more spectacular the consequences when those centers begin to fail. By the time the palaces burn or empty, much of the collapse has already happened in invisible form. It has happened in eroded trust, overstrained hierarchies, rigid institutions, narrowing options, and the inability of impressive systems to imagine their own limits. The cities that fall are only the visible shells of a deeper failure. Beneath the stones lies a political lesson. As old as civilization itself, power concentrated brilliantly can also break brilliantly, and when it does, the fall feels sudden not because the weakness was absent, but because it had been hidden inside success for so long. Once several kingdoms begin to fail at once, the crisis starts to generate its own momentum. This is the point where older explanations that work in isolation begin to feel insufficient on their own. Drought can weaken a state. Raiding can damage trade. Internal rivalries can paralyze decision-making. An earthquake can ruin a city. Migration can destabilize frontiers. Any one of these is serious. But what makes the Bronze Age collapse so unsettling is the likelihood that many of them are striking the same world in overlapping waves, turning stress into cascade. A society might recover from one disaster. It might even recover from two. A chain of disasters, each magnifying the last, is a different matter entirely. Earthquakes have long occupied a special place in discussions of this period, partly because the eastern Mediterranean sits in a seismically active zone, and partly because archaeology sometimes reveals collapse patterns that can plausibly be linked to seismic damage. Walls buckle in strange ways. Buildings fall without obvious burn traces. Settlements in vulnerable regions show destruction that does not neatly fit invasion. For a time, some scholars proposed what became known as an earthquake storm, a sequence of major quakes affecting multiple sites over time and contributing significantly to the wider collapse. The idea is attractive because it explains why some cities could be badly damaged even before attackers arrived, and why already stressed societies might suddenly find themselves defending broken walls, ruined storage areas, and traumatized populations. Yet earthquakes alone cannot solve the mystery. They do not explain the disappearance of palace systems across such a broad political and economic landscape. They do not account for collapsing trade, shrinking literacy, maritime violence, or long-term fragmentation. Scholars still debate how large a role seismic events really played, and caution is necessary because ruined stones can be interpreted in multiple ways. A city weakened by quake may later burn. A destroyed layer may combine several forms of damage. The evidence remains incomplete. Even so, earthquakes likely matter as one more destabilizing force in an already troubled age. They do not need to be the main cause to be important. In a brittle world, sudden physical destruction can be enough to push weak systems past recovery. The same is true of migration. Human movement has always been part of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern story, but movement becomes more dangerous when states lose the capacity to manage it. A drought-stricken district may send families toward better land. A ruined city may produce refugees. Mercenaries without pay may drift into raiding. Communities displaced by war or crop failure may collide with settled populations already living close to subsistence margins. This does not create a simple picture of invaders and victims. It creates a far more unstable reality in which one kingdom's failure becomes another kingdom's demographic pressure. Refugees are not abstractions in such a world. They are mouths to feed labour, to absorb strangers to fear, and potential soldiers if they are armed and desperate. That movement can produce panic even where immediate violence is absent. News of populations on the move of coastal settlements threatened of food shortages, inland of royal armies stretched thin changes behaviour long before every danger becomes visible at the gates. Communities begin to fortify, hoard, relocate or defect. Local leaders make decisions based on rumour as much as fact. Some may resist the central state, others may seek protection from powers that are themselves weakening. Great systems often depend on confidence more than they admit. Once confidence starts to fracture, political order can erode with remarkable speed. A lesser known but revealing detail is that panic in ancient states does not have to leave dramatic literary testimony to be real. It appears indirectly. A sudden focus on coastal defence in administrative tablets, emergency grain requests, cities abandoned earlier than expected, settlement patterns shifting toward more defensible terrain, regional fragmentation in places once tied to strong centres. These are the archaeological and textual shadows of fear. People do not always carve panic into stone, but they live differently under its pressure. The Bronze Age collapse becomes more intelligible when seen not only as a sequence of causes, but as a sequence of frightened adaptations, each one rational in the short term and destabilizing in the long term. There is also a cruel compounding effect when earthquake, migration and war intersect. A quake-damaged city is harder to defend. A population displaced by famine may move into a region whose own harvest is weak. A kingdom already struggling to provision troops may suddenly need to shelter refugees or suppress unrest. A port struck by attack can no longer import the food needed after a local agricultural failure. These are not separate lines of explanation running in parallel. They are interlocking pressures. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, because the collapse may be the result of this very interlocking. The system does not fail from one wound. It fails from cumulative injury. The great powers of the Bronze Age are particularly vulnerable to such chains because they are large enough to have many exposed points and centralized enough that failure in one zone quickly affects another. Egypt survives partly because of its deep agricultural base in the Nile Valley and its long state tradition, but even Egypt is visibly strained by the effort required to repel major threats. The Hittite Empire, more exposed to internal fragmentation, frontier pressures, and logistical complexity, proves less resilient. Mycenaean palace society, dependent on a network of regional centres and administrative structures, breaks apart into smaller worlds. The Levantine ports, so crucial to trade, suffer especially from maritime violence and wider instability. What makes the map so tragic is that each region's weakness is slightly different, but the converging disasters are able to exploit all of them. One of the most haunting possibilities is that contemporaries may not have understood the scale of the crisis even while living inside it. They would have recognized local danger clearly enough: the failed harvest, the enemy ships, the missing grain, the damaged walls, the absent allies. But the full pattern, the sense that an entire international age was ending, may only become visible in fragments, and too late. A ruler might believe that once one rebellion is crushed, or one shipment secured, order will resume. A city might think the danger lies offshore while the deeper problem is inland scarcity. A provincial official might still trust the capital to intervene. This lag between lived crisis and systemic understanding is common in collapses. People know enough to suffer, but not enough to see the whole shape at once. This is why the Bronze Age collapse resists clean storytelling. It is not a tale of a single villain or a single decisive battle. It is a world entering a state where too many things can go wrong together. A palace can survive invasion if food is secure. It can survive scarcity if trade holds. It can survive political tension if legitimacy remains strong. It can survive earthquake if labour and resources can be mobilized for rebuilding. But if food is insecure, trade, disrupted politics, brittle, labour strained and shocks arriving in succession, then even impressive systems begin to lose coherence. They do not simply suffer damage. They stop being able to imagine a route back to normal. The emotional force of this part of the story lies in that loss of normality. Once panic enters a civilization, time feels different. A delayed shipment is no longer a bureaucratic annoyance, it is a threat. A group of migrants is no longer just a social challenge. It is a sign that the map itself is moving. A damaged gate is no longer one repair among many. It may be the line between survival and annihilation. Ancient people would not have used the modern language of systems failure, but they would have recognized the sensation of a world becoming less predictable, less governable, and less familiar. By now, the collapse is no longer only a matter of burned cities and broken treaties. It is a climate of instability spreading through the habits of life. Earthquakes may shake walls, migrations may unsettle borders, panic may hollow out confidence. Each on its own is survivable. Together they become something heavier, an age in which disaster stops arriving as an event and becomes an environment. In that environment, kingdoms that once seemed immovable begin to behave like wounded organisms, reactive, overextended, and increasingly unable to protect the worlds they built. The final unravelling will not be a clean fall from height. It will be a darkening of the whole horizon, until the old Bronze Age order can no longer see a path back to itself. Then the lights begin to go out. Not everywhere at once, not in one theatrical instant, but across enough of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East that the effect in hindsight feels unmistakable. Palaces that had once coordinated labour and tribute fall silent. Archives cease. Regular long-distance exchange thins to a fraction of what it had been. Fine imported goods become rarer. Monumental building slows or stops. In some places settlements shrink or move. In others they vanish from the record altogether for a time. A world that had been noisy with administration ceremony, maritime traffic and royal ambition becomes harder to hear. That is one of the deepest meanings of collapse. It is not only destruction, it is the disappearance of density. The phrase Dark Age is often used for what follows in parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially after the fall of the Mycenaean palace world, but the term needs care. It can suggest a total void, a civilization simply switched off. The reality is more complicated. People remain, villages endure, farmers still plant, fishers still work, the coast herders still move animals. Craftsmen still make what they can from what remains available. Some places continue in reduced form rather than vanishing. Yet something essential has changed. The large-scale coordination that once linked so many regions through diplomacy, writing, trade, and centralized redistribution has fractured. The world is not empty. It is dimmer, smaller, and more local. In Greece, this dimming is particularly striking. The Mycenaean palaces had been the centres of administration, redistribution, elite culture and literacy in Linear B. When they fall, writing in that form disappears. The loss is not merely symbolic, it reflects a profound narrowing of institutional life. A palace bureaucracy had needed records to function. Once the bureaucracy is gone, so is the social world that sustained that script. Monumental architecture declines, imported luxuries shrink. Population appears to contract in some regions. Some settlements are abandoned, others move to more defensible or more practical locations. What follows is not immediate oblivion, but a long period in which the old scale of political and cultural integration is simply no longer there. This narrowing affects memory itself. One of the strangest consequences of the Bronze Age collapse is that whole worlds become harder for later people to imagine clearly. In Greece, memories of the Mycenaean age may survive in distorted form in heroic traditions, but the exact administrative and political reality of the palace world is gone. The people who live centuries later among ruined walls do not possess the archive's routines or international context that had once made those walls intelligible. That is one of the quieter tragedies of collapse. The living inherit ruins they cannot fully explain. Magnitude becomes legend because the system that made it real has disappeared. Elsewhere across the eastern Mediterranean, the pattern varies, but the direction is similar. Long-distance trade contracts sharply. This does not mean all exchange stops. Some maritime networks continue in humbler form, and local or regional trade remains possible. But the great integrated system of copper-tin luxury goods, diplomatic gift exchange, and palace-managed movement no longer operates at the old scale. Specialists who once depended on central patronage or imported raw materials must adapt or disappear. Fine craftsmanship survives unevenly. Writing traditions persist in some regions better than others, but the overall density of literate administration is reduced. The whole connected Bronze Age world becomes more fragmented. The human experience of that fragmentation must have been deeply uneven. For elites tied directly to palaces, the loss is catastrophic. Status, office, and protection vanish with the centres that sustained them. For scribes, it can mean the end of their profession. For merchants dependent on large routes and secure ports, it means a world of greater risk and thinner opportunities. For farmers and villagers, the picture is more complex. Some may suffer terribly through violence, displacement, or famine. Others may find that the disappearance of centralized extraction creates new forms of local autonomy, though often in poorer and less secure conditions. What survives in the record suggests not a universally identical misery, but a broad reduction in complexity and scale that touches nearly everyone. A lesser-known but deeply telling detail of this post-collapse world is the change in material habits. In many regions, pottery styles become simpler or more local. Architecture often grows less monumental and more practical. Burial practices shift. Imported items become rarer. The difference is not merely aesthetic, it is structural. Simpler goods reflect shorter supply chains, smaller political units, less concentrated wealth, and fewer institutions capable of sustaining specialized production at high volume. Archaeologists sometimes refer to this kind of change in neutral terms, but to people living through it, the difference must have been tangible. Life becomes more immediate, horizons shorten, the sea and roads still exist, but they no longer carry the same density of expectation. This is also when silence spreads across the record in unsettling ways. Archaeologists can excavate destruction, reoccupation, and long-term change, but absence has its own force. Fewer texts survive because fewer texts are being produced. Fewer monumental claims are carved because fewer states can afford that kind of performance. The courtly voice of the Bronze Age, so self-assured in diplomacy and royal display, weakens dramatically in many areas. When history loses writing, it does not lose the people who lived it. It loses their administrative breathing. We can still see bones, seeds, walls, tools, hearths, and ceramics, but we hear less of the world speaking in its own formal language. The shrinkage of trade has especially wide consequences. Bronze itself becomes harder to sustain at scale when the old metal roots weaken, and over time iron becomes more significant in many regions. This is not an immediate technological revolution sweeping away the past overnight. Early iron is often difficult to work and not automatically superior in all uses. But in the longer aftermath, a world less dependent on scarce tin and on the trade systems that carried it creates conditions in which iron can become increasingly practical and transformative. The Bronze Age collapse does not simply destroy. It rearranges the material basis of the next age. Scholars still debate how dark this darkness truly is, and rightly so. Some regions remain more continuous than older scholarship once allowed. Some communities adapt creatively. Some local cultures begin laying foundations for future growth in ways that are easy to miss if one looks only for vanished palaces. The evidence remains incomplete, and broad labels can flatten important differences. Yet caution does not erase the larger pattern. Measured in literacy centralization, international exchange, and monumental complexity, much of the Eastern Mediterranean becomes less connected and less elaborate for generations. A whole civilizational texture is thinned. What makes this aftermath so haunting is that it is not only loss in the abstract, it is the loss of habit. The old world had trained people to expect routes, courts, archives, emissaries, shipments, and the visible permanence of great centres. The post-collapse world teaches different lessons. Keep closer to local resources, trust smaller units, fortify where possible, adapt to uncertainty. Remember that large systems fail. That shift may not be stated anywhere plainly, but it is written into settlement patterns, material culture, and the disappearance of palace life across wide areas. A civilization has not merely fallen, its assumptions have changed. By now, the Bronze Age collapse has done what few ancient crises manage on such a scale. It has not only destroyed cities and dynasties, it has made the world itself feel smaller. Roots that once tied kingdoms together now carry less. Archives that once ordered wealth and labour now lie buried. Great courts that once addressed one another as peers are ash ruin or memory. In their place stand scattered communities, diminished centres, and a harder landscape in which survival depends less on the confidence of large institutions and more on the stubborn adaptability of local life. The world goes dark not because humanity disappears, but because the bright web of connection that had made the age so remarkable has been torn apart strand by strand until only fragments still catch the light. And yet not everyone falls. That is one of the most important and revealing facts in the aftermath. If the Bronze Age collapse were only a story of total destruction, it would be simpler, cleaner, and less true. Some powers endure in altered form, some cities adapt, some communities retreat, reorganize, and survive precisely because they are smaller, tougher, or less dependent on the kinds of centralized systems that have just failed. The world after the collapse is dimmer, but it is not dead. It is full of survivors learning how to live inside the ruins of an age that had once seemed too sophisticated to break. Egypt is the most obvious great survivor, though even Egypt pays heavily for that survival. The New Kingdom does not vanish in the same way the Hittite Empire vanishes, or the Mycenaean palace system vanishes. Its state tradition, agricultural base, and geographic advantages give it resilience that many other Bronze Age powers lack. The Nile Valley remains one of the most dependable food-producing landscapes in the ancient world when properly managed. Egypt also benefits from a long and deeply rooted political culture, capable of mobilizing labor-projecting royal ideology and sustaining institutions through crisis. That does not make it invulnerable. Far from it. The Egyptian state emerges from this era strained, militarized, and increasingly burdened by the cost of defending itself in a changing world. The inscriptions of Ramesses III present survival as triumph, and in one sense that is fair. Egypt does withstand serious threats that would have destroyed lesser states. But victory carries its own exhaustion. Military defense, frontier pressure, and economic strain leave marks. By the early 12th century, BCE records from Egypt begin to reveal labor unrest, delayed rations, and the kind of fiscal tension one would not expect from a civilization at ease. One famous episode from Deir el-Medina, where royal tomb workers protest missed grain payments, offers a startling glimpse into this changed reality. It is often called the first recorded labour strike, though the modern label can be misleading. Still, the event matters enormously. It shows that even a surviving giant is under strain severe enough to interrupt the most symbolically important work of royal power. Egypt lives through the collapse, but it does not do so unchanged. That distinction matters because survival is not the same as continuity. Egypt remains standing, yet the age of easy imperial confidence is ending. Its reach into parts of the Levant weakens. Its ability to dominate the international arena of the Late Bronze Age is diminished. It still possesses grandeur ritual and formidable institutional memory, but it is now operating in a harsher and more fragmented environment. The old club of great kings has been shattered. Diplomacy does not disappear, but the world that once gave it such dense meaning has thinned. Egypt survives partly by adjusting to that reality, not by restoring the old order around itself. Elsewhere, survival takes more local and less spectacular forms. In the Levant, not all cities are annihilated and not all destruction is permanent. Some sites are reoccupied quickly. Others continue with altered populations, new elites, or simplified economies. Coastal communities in particular prove capable over time of rebuilding maritime activity, even if the old Bronze Age system of palace-managed trade has collapsed. What survives in the record suggests that adaptability often favours smaller centres, port communities and mixed economies better able to improvise than the monumental palace states had been. This is one of the deep ironies of the collapse. The largest and most elaborate systems often prove less resilient than humbler societies that can pivot more easily. In Cyprus too there is both disruption and continuity. The island's Bronze Age world suffers from the collapse of the larger trade networks on which much of its prosperity had depended, especially given the central importance of copper. Yet Cyprus does not become an empty ruin. Communities shift sites are reorganized and the island remains a meaningful player in the eastern Mediterranean. The exact sequence of changes and migrations there remains debated because archaeology reveals complexity rather than a single clean story. But Cyprus shows how regions embedded in the old system can survive by transformation rather than simple extinction. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points toward persistence through adjustment. A lesser known but revealing detail of this post-collapse landscape is the growing importance of upland and marginal communities that had once stood at the edges of palace-centered power. In parts of the southern Levant and elsewhere, smaller settlements in hill country or less intensively controlled zones become more visible in the archaeological record. Some of these communities may have existed all along with relatively low visibility. Others appear to expand or reorganize in the changed conditions after the collapse. Without large palace institutions dominating the lowlands and main routes to the same extent, communities once peripheral can become the nuclei of new political worlds. Survival, in other words, does not always belong to the strongest by old standards. It often belongs to those least invested in the forms of complexity that just failed. This helps explain why the aftermath is not uniform. In some regions, the collapse feels like an ending. In others, it feels like a harsh opening. Smaller groups can build from the wreckage because the old powers are gone or weakened. Highland communities, mobile populations, local maritime traders and regional elites no longer overshadowed by imperial courts all find room to maneuver in a political landscape that has suddenly become less hierarchical, even if more dangerous. Scholars still debate exactly how these transitions unfold in every region, but the broader pattern is clear enough. The breakdown of giant systems creates space for smaller survivors. The human experience of survival must have been deeply practical. A village that is not burned still has to live with reduced trade, uncertain security, and altered political obligations. A city that reoccupies its ruins still has to function without the old abundance of imported materials and centralized support. A surviving kingdom still has to pay soldiers, feed workers, and maintain legitimacy with fewer resources and fewer dependable partners. Nothing about survival in this world is easy. It is often austere, improvisational, and local. Yet there is resilience in that austerity. People learn to rely on mixed subsistence, shorter networks, smaller political scales, and more defensible terrain. They do not restore the Bronze Age, they outlast it. There is also something revealing in what no longer survives. Many of the most elaborate palace-centered practices disappear or shrink, while simpler and more flexible forms of social organization endure. This suggests that resilience in times of systems failure may depend less on maximum complexity than on adaptability, redundancy, and local control. Ancient people would not have expressed the lesson in those terms, but the archaeological record hints at it repeatedly. The highly centralized states are the most dramatic casualties. The communities that make it through are often the ones capable of functioning without constant long-distance input or heavy bureaucratic coordination. Egypt's survival therefore stands beside, not above, these other forms of endurance. It remains the grandest continuous state in the region, but even it behaves increasingly like a power under pressure, not a master of a stable international age. Its endurance is real, yet it is also a reminder that surviving a collapse can mean living on in a diminished world. The palaces and temples still stand, rituals continue. Kings still claim cosmic authority, but the geopolitical environment around them is no longer the same. The Great Bronze Age order has been broken. What remains must learn new habits. By now the collapse has stripped away the illusion that scale alone protects civilization. Some of the largest and most sophisticated powers are gone. Some smaller, more flexible communities remain. Others are forming in the spaces left behind. The survivors are important not because they cancel the story of destruction, but because they reveal what resilience actually looks like when a world system fails. It is rarely elegant. It does not usually preserve the full splendor of what came before. It works through adaptation, contraction, relocation, improvisation, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. That stubbornness gives the aftermath its human texture. Beneath the ruined palaces and silent archives, life continues. Fields are planted again where possible. New leaders emerge in old places. Coastlines once racked by fear begin slowly to carry exchange again. Hill communities become more numerous, more organized, more confident. Egypt endures though altered. Cyprus persists though transformed. Levantine towns survive in fragment and rebuild in fragment. The old Bronze Age world is dead, but the people who lived through its fall do not simply vanish with it. They become the bridge into whatever comes next, carrying forward not the grandeur of the lost age, but the harder knowledge of how to remain when grandeur has failed. What rises from the wreckage is not a restoration. The old world does not return with fresh kings and repaired harbours, as though the collapse had only been a severe interruption. Too much has been lost for that. Too many palaces are ash, too many archives silent, too many roots broken, too many political habits discredited. What comes next is harsher, leaner, and in some ways more inventive. The centuries after the Bronze Age collapse do not inherit a functioning international system. They inherit fragments, and from those fragments new societies begin to assemble a different order. The Iron Age does not arrive as a triumphant improvement. It arrives as an adaptation to a changed world. One of the most important shifts is material. Bronze had tied the great palace states to long-distance supply in a particularly vulnerable way, because copper and tin rarely came from the same place, and both had to move through stable networks to meet in the workshop. Iron changes that balance gradually. It is not an overnight revolution. Early iron is often inferior in quality to well-made bronze and smithing. It effectively requires techniques not instantly mastered everywhere. For a time, iron remains difficult, prestigious, or limited rather than universally practical. Scholars still debate how quickly iron technology spreads and how decisive it is in the earliest post-collapse generations. But over the longer run, a world less able to rely on the old bronze roots becomes more open to a metal that, once workable, depends less on fragile international supply chains. That matters enormously. A harder, more localized age is beginning to find a harder, more local material base. At the same time, the political map is being redrawn by survivors, migrants, and peripheral peoples who now have more room to form lasting identities. Along the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities emerge more clearly into history as maritime powers of extraordinary adaptability. They are not entirely new in a biological sense, nor do they spring from nothing. Their roots lie in Canaanite urban traditions that long predate the collapse. But in the changed post-Bronze Age environment, cities such as Tyre, Sidon and Byblos become central players in a different kind of Mediterranean world. They are smaller and more flexible than the great palace empires had been. Their strength lies not in dominating vast inland territories, but in trade, seafaring, skillcraft production, and the ability to operate across fragmented political landscapes. Where the old system had relied on royal courts and international diplomacy among giant states, the Phoenician model thrives through networks, ports, exchange and movement in a scattered world that is a powerful advantage. In the highlands of the southern Levant, new communities also become more visible. Among them are the early populations that later form the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Their origins remain debated in detail. Scholars still argue over the balance between local continuity, social transformation, pastoral sedentary interaction, and the legacy of earlier Canaanite populations. The evidence remains incomplete, and simple conquest narratives no longer satisfy most historians or archaeologists. What survives in the record suggests something subtler. The collapse of older lowland powers creates space for smaller highland communities to expand, settle, and eventually develop more coherent identities. These are not palace civilizations in the old Bronze Age sense. They are products of a harsher and more fragmented landscape, shaped by local adaptation rather than international courtly integration. Farther north and east, the vacuum left by fallen powers does not remain empty forever. Assyria, battered, but never wholly erased, eventually reasserts itself with remarkable force. The Neo-Assyrian world belongs to a later phase, but its rise is part of the long answer to the collapse. The old Bronze Age international order of rough parity among several great powers gives way over time to a different pattern in which more militarized and territorially aggressive states begin to dominate. The later Assyrian expansion is built in a world already transformed by the collapse, a world in which old rivals are gone. Political fragmentation has created openings, and the memory of instability still sits beneath the surface. What comes after the Bronze Age is not less violent. In some ways it is more openly brutal, more direct in its imperial logic, and less dependent on the delicate gift exchange etiquette of the earlier age. The Aegean too begins slowly to reassemble itself, though not yet into the classical world later centuries will celebrate. The immediate post-collapse period in Greece is poor in many old measures, with diminished literacy, smaller communities, and less monumental centralization. Yet it is also a time of cultural recombination. Populations move. Oral tradition preserves fragments of a vanished heroic past. New settlement patterns emerge. Over many generations, these changes lay foundations for the later polis world, though no one living in the early aftermath could have seen that future clearly. What they know instead is a harder local existence among ruins, in which memory of former greatness survives as echo rather than administrative fact. A lesser-known but striking detail of this new age is the changing nature of connectivity. The old Bronze Age world had been connected through palace institutions, elite diplomacy, and managed flows of strategic materials. The post-collapse world reconnects differently. It is less centralized, more entrepreneurial, more dependent on city networks and mobile groups than on a handful of giant courts. Phoenician traders can operate with a flexibility the fallen palace systems never had. Ironworking can spread through communities not integrated into the older bronze routes. Smaller kingdoms can rise in regions that had once been squeezed between imperial centers. The network returns, but in a looser and more uneven form. This does not make the new world gentler. On the contrary, it may feel more dangerous to those living in it. Fragmentation means more local wars, more fortified settlements, more uncertainty, and fewer assumptions that a large diplomatic order will absorb shocks. The old world had been fragile in a hidden way. The new one is often harsh in a visible way. Power is more naked. Survival depends more obviously on defensibility, local resources, and practical toughness. Even the material culture reflects that mood. The post-collapse centuries often favor utility over spectacle, durable networks over ceremonial excess, and smaller political scales over world-spanning pretension. Yet there is creativity in this severity. The alphabetic traditions that will eventually transform literacy spread through Levantine contexts, shaped in part by this new maritime world. Trade begins to recover on different terms. New ethnic and political identities harden in zones once held in the orbit of older empires. Iron tools and weapons slowly become more normal. Communities that would have been peripheral in the Bronze Age now become central to Iron Age history. The collapse, in other words, is not only a graveyard of lost kingdoms, it is also the brutal clearing in which new forms of civilization take root. No single explanation fully accounts for why some of these new societies prove so effective in the changed landscape, but one answer lies in scale. They are generally operating with structures better suited to the world that exists after the collapse rather than the world that existed before it. They ask less of long-distance coordination. They are often more compact, more regionally grounded, and less dependent on maintaining a vast palatial facade. This does not guarantee success, of course. Many small states fail too, but the post-collapse environment seems to reward flexibility more than grandeur. The age of giant bronze-fed palace systems has ended. The age emerging in its place belongs to tougher networks, harder metals, smaller states, and communities shaped by memory of ruin. That memory matters. Even where later peoples do not preserve a factual account of the collapse, they inherit its altered landscape. Ruined citadels, abandoned cities, disrupted routes, and faded lineages all shape what seems possible. New kingdoms grow in the shadow of old failure. New traders sail waters once patrolled by lost palace powers. New iron blades are forged in a world that has learned painfully what happens when bronze roots break. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that the Iron Age is born not from simple progress, but from adaptation after catastrophe. By now the ancient world has changed its logic. The old web of courtly reciprocity, copper and tin exchange, palace archives, and tightly managed surplus is gone. In its place comes a rougher order of maritime city-states, rising highland communities, revived imperial ambition in new forms and technologies that fit a more fragmented age. The Bronze Age collapses quickly on the scale of history. The world that replaces it takes longer to assemble, but assemble it does. Out of the ashes come Phoenician sailors, Israelite hill settlements, Assyrian resurgence, and the long uneven spread of iron. The New Age is not brighter in any simple sense. It is harder, leaner, and more resilient in different ways. It does not erase the collapse, it carries its imprint forward. What makes this collapse endure in memory is not simply its scale. Though the scale is immense, it is the uncomfortable familiarity of its logic. A rich and connected world grows confident in its systems. It learns to move metals, grain messages, prestige and power across long distances. It builds institutions so effective that they begin to seem natural, almost permanent. The roots feel dependable, the palaces feel necessary, the hierarchies feel fixed. Then over the span of a few generations, nearly all of it begins to fail. Not because civilization itself was an illusion, but because civilization had become dependent on a balance more fragile than it understood. That is why the end of the Bronze Age still feels less like an ancient curiosity and more like a warning sent from very far away. There is a temptation, when looking at a catastrophe this large, to search for a dramatic single cause that preserves the idea of a basically stable world ruined by one extraordinary blow. It is easier to imagine marauding invaders a decisive drought, one vast earthquake sequence, or one fatal war than to accept that systems often collapse through interaction. Yet the Bronze Age world appears to have fallen precisely because it was so interconnected. Its strengths are real: diplomacy, trade administration, specialization, storage, maritime reach, political sophistication. Those strengths do not vanish. They become liabilities under compound stress. The more tightly woven the world becomes, the farther a local failure can travel. The more centralized its institutions become, the more damaging it is when they stop working. The more prosperous its elites become, the harder they may squeeze a society already under pressure. In that sense, the collapse is not a contradiction of complexity. It is one of complexity's oldest dangers. This is one reason scholars continue returning to the Bronze Age collapse, not only to refine chronology or debate causes, but because the event illuminates a pattern that appears again and again in history. Civilizations rarely announce that they are becoming brittle. They usually look strong while doing so. Their roads are full, their storehouses are active, their rulers still perform magnificence, their bureaucracy still counts, their merchants still sail. What changes first is often invisible to those who trust the surface. Margins shrink, redundancies weaken, trust erodes, supplies become less secure, institutions become less adaptive. Once several shocks arrive close together, what had seemed like solidity reveals itself as a narrow band of stability stretched across many dependencies. The Bronze Age collapse also matters because it destroys one of the comforting myths people like to tell about the past, that the rise of a large civilization is a one-way process. It is not. Complexity can be built, but it can also be lost. Literacy can narrow, trade can contract, monumental power can vanish. A whole international order can disappear so thoroughly that later generations remember it only dimly through legend-broken walls and scattered survivals. The fall of the late Bronze Age is one of the clearest examples of that truth. It reminds us that progress is not evenly accumulated. Human beings can inherit less than their ancestors, no less in practical terms, and live in smaller worlds after living in larger ones. At the same time, the collapse offers a harder and more hopeful lesson. What survives after failure is not nothing. People adapt. Communities reorganize. New cultures emerge from the ruins. Smaller and more flexible systems can sometimes endure what grand systems cannot. The post-collapse world is harsher, but it is not empty. Phoenician maritime networks rise from coastal resilience. Highland communities become future kingdoms. Assyria returns in a transformed imperial age. Iron spreads through a world that no longer trusts bronze-fed palace supply chains. Even in darkness, history keeps moving. The collapse is therefore not only about fragility, it is also about survival after fragility has been exposed. A lesser known and quietly profound detail of this legacy is how much of later history grows in the spaces opened by the catastrophe. The Mediterranean world that eventually produces classical Greece-Phoenician expansion, the kingdoms of the Levant and the great Iron Age empires, does not emerge despite the Bronze Age collapse. It emerges through the world the collapse creates. The old palace order had been so dominant that other forms of political life remained smaller or more peripheral. Once it fell, new forms had room to grow. This does not make the destruction good or necessary or somehow justified by what came later. It means only that history is often built not on smooth succession, but on uneven replacement. Still, what lingers most is the image of interdependence turning dangerous. That is the heart of the story. Egypt needs roots. The Hittites need food and loyal vassals. Mycenaean palaces need administration and supply. Ugarit needs ships and trust. Cyprus needs demand for copper. Everyone needs the sea to remain a corridor instead of a threat, the harvest to remain enough, the palaces to remain functional, the messages to arrive, the roads to hold the subjects to obey. For generations, enough of those conditions remain true at once that the world feels secure. Then they do not. No single explanation fully accounts for the collapse, because the collapse is what happens when too many explanations become true together. That is why the Bronze Age collapse still speaks so directly across the distance of 3,000 years. It is not merely about ancient kings or vanished ports. It is about the hidden cost of living inside systems that reward connection while quietly reducing resilience. It is about how prosperity can disguise dependency. It is about how institutions designed for efficiency can struggle with surprise. It is about how people at the center often fail to see the scale of danger until the edges are already burning. And it is about how after the collapse, those who remain must rebuild with fewer illusions. Perhaps that is the deepest legacy of all. The people who come after do not just inherit the ruins of cities, they inherit the memory, however broken, that great worlds can end. Later societies in the Mediterranean and Near East build again, trade again, fight again, and create fresh empires, but they do so on landscapes marked by an older lesson. Permanence is difficult, and interdependence is never free. The Bronze Age world had seemed broad enough, rich enough, and experienced enough to master its dangers. Instead, it discovered that complexity can multiply danger just as effectively as it multiplies power, and so the collapse still matters because it changes the scale at which human history is imagined. It is not one city lost to time, not one dynasty overthrown, not one people swallowed by desert or sea. It is nearly an entire ancient world entering crisis together, then breaking apart so thoroughly that later ages have to begin again from fragments. It is a reminder that civilization is not a wall between humanity and chaos. It is a pattern held in place by food, trust roots, institutions, habit, and luck. When enough of those fail together, even the grandest age can fall with startling speed. The ashes of the palaces, the abandoned ports, the vanished archives, the silence where royal letters once moved so easily, all of them still carry that message. The Bronze Age collapse is ancient but not remote in its meaning. It tells us that complex worlds are powerful and exposed at the same time, and that their true weakness often hides inside the very networks that once made them shine. Word count 1436. The wind moves through broken stone more gently than fire ever did. By the time later generations walk among the ruins, the terror is gone from the air. No one hears the last warning from Ugarit, or sees the final scribes at Pylos, or watches the smoke rise from a Hittite storehouse. Those moments have passed beyond recovery. What remains is quieter. A fallen wall half covered in grass, a harbour that no longer receives the ships it was built for, a palace courtyard open to the sky, seeds charred in storage jars still waiting in darkness for hands that never return. That is how ancient collapse often survives, not as one loud memory, but as a long silence spread across the land. The kings disappear first, then the roots, then the habits of administration, then even the knowledge of what these places once were. Later, people settle nearby, build with old stones, tell partial stories and move on. The world continues, but on different terms. Sheep graze where envoys once stood. Small fires burn in simpler houses near the bones of larger ones. The sea keeps moving against the shore, indifferent to the names of the powers it once connected. There is something almost tender in that indifference. It reminds us that even the greatest systems are temporary arrangements made against a much larger backdrop of weather, landscape, hunger, memory, and time. The Bronze Age kingdoms gathered wealth, wrote treaties, commanded armies, and believed, as complex societies often do, that order could be managed if only enough power and intelligence were applied to it. For a long while they were right. Then they were not. The tragedy is real, but so is the humility it leaves behind, because the story does not end in emptiness. It ends in survival of another kind. People remain in the shattered world. They plant again, sail again, trade again, and build again, though more carefully and often more modestly. New languages, new kingdoms, new metals, and new identities rise where old ones failed. History does not stop at the collapse. It simply loses one of its grandest shapes and takes on another. And perhaps that is the final image worth holding. Not the flames themselves, though they matter. Not the invaders, the droughts, the broken palaces, or the vanished scripts, though all of them belong to the story. But a darker shoreline after the ships have gone, and beyond it the first uncertain lights of another age appearing one by one. The ancient world collapses quickly, then spends generations becoming something else. In that long fading and slow return, the past leaves behind one of its clearest truths. Civilizations are vast but fragile. Memory is incomplete but stubborn. And even after a world falls silent, human life continues quietly among the ruins waiting for morning.